Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. Today's episode is brought to you by Black Rifle Coffee. I'm looking right now at their website, and the newest thing that I'm seeing is they have a collaboration with GoRuck. They're on their main landing page, the banner, they have a BRCC and GoRuck sweepstakes. And what's included is you get 2 VIP tickets to the GoRuck Sand Lot in Jacksonville, 2 backpacks, shoes, swag, coffee. Holy cow, you get a ton of stuff. So, if that's your thing, I've actually never done one of these GoRuck events, but I've heard some pretty good things about them and also about the founders. But again, take that with a grain. I've never really been a part of it. If that's not your thing, well, just go to blackriflecoffee.com and get all the coffee needs that you might have for your day, for your week, for your month, for your friends. Coffee subscriptions and everything that you need to actually make coffee for yourself that doesn't taste like shit. And don't use a French press by any means. Use a pour over. Be a professional. Be better than a French press. And that's it. My guest today, the only way that I feel like I can describe him, is the most interesting man alive. His name is Mike McDowell, and I met him when we were out in Antarctica. He's one of the 4 partners of Antarctic Logistics and Exploration. We had just completed our first practice jump out in Antarctica, and they brought some champagne out for us, which, okay, interesting. Didn't think that was going to happen. And sat down and just listened to him talk for what became hours. And I actually regret not going and getting a microphone at that time, because he talked about so many of the things that he had done in his life, whether that be as a scientist, traveling the world, seeing the Titanic multiple times, being in the submarine when the Bismarck was first seen visually, being involved in an organization that puts people into space, traveling to the Himalayas, everything in between. It was an unbelievable conversation that we had that night. So of course I grabbed him. I had Logan and Jericho from Black Rifle Coffee join me as well, and sat down for just over 3 hours to listen to this incredible story. And one thing I want people to realize from this story is that Mike didn't actually go into business until his late 30s. So think about that when you listen to him talk and all the things that he accomplished before and after. My point in saying that is, it's never too late. Keep pushing yourself as hard as you possibly can. And on that note, I think we should get into this. Episode number 269, with the most interesting man on the face of the planet, Mike McDowell. Enjoy.
Okay, got the red smoke. Gun run, north and south, west of the smoke, west of the smoke. Okay, copy, west of the smoke. I'm looking at danger close now. Come on with it, baby, give it to me, I need it. You're cleared hot. Copy, cleared hot.
I actually don't even know where to start. Because, what was it, 2 nights ago? We were sitting, it was the day that we jumped.
Yes.
And you treated us to a lovely après skydive of champagne and beer. And we were in the, what do you guys call that, the dining hall?
Yeah. Yeah.
I was going to call it the mess tent, but it's a little too military for me.
Yeah, no, we call it the mess tent as well, so yeah.
So we were in the dining hall, and you started going and talking about your experiences in life and in business, and I actually almost got up and grabbed the microphone at that point and just wanted to record you talking, but I didn't want to interrupt you. I think you are single-handedly the most interesting man I've ever met in my life.
Yeah, well, I'll introduce you to others who I think far surpass me, but you know, we've got a few stories, yeah, and some experiences. Yeah.
Where do you boys think we should start?
I think start at the beginning. Like
Actually,
this amazing man.
Let's start where I have a question. Because I do want to start at the beginning, but where we are now, when you were growing up, is this where we are right now in Antarctica at Union Glacier at the ALE camp, which you're a quarter owner of? Is this what you wanted to do / thought that you would be doing?
Absolutely not. We were brought up in Sydney. Myself and my brother, who's also a 25% partner here. He's doing a lot of the back office stuff at the moment. He's back in Australia. We were a very ordinary, in a good way, very ordinary, lower middle class family. There was no spare cash at the end of the week. My mother managed the money, wrote a budget out. We'd end up with threepence or sixpence or 2 shillings left. We were pound shillings and pence in those days. We'd end up, Mum would say, it's a good week, we've got 5 shillings left. But we had everything that we needed. I had a great mum, good dad as well. And so it's amazing now how kids have these expectations that we never had. If you had a good meal on on the plate each night, and you had clothing, and it used to always be a big deal about school shoes. That was a big deal, school starting, we've got to get new school shoes and whatever. It was very basic. And of course we were growing up in an era where you'd come home at the end of the day, at the end of a school day, straight out into the streets. There was none of this screen fixation. I'm sure you guys were the same. You'd actually go out and play with other kids, be it a bit of football, a bit of cricket or whatever.
Do you think, though, that if you had screens, that you would have had that fixation as well? Because I've thought about that. I watch my own children, and the devices are amazing. And I know they're designed properly when you don't have to actually teach a child how to use an iPad. In about 5 minutes, they're already deeper into a submenu. I'm like, oh, I don't know how you did that. So I've thought about that. I think that our generation would have that same struggle of addiction.
I'm absolutely in agreement. I've got it now, at later in life, and I detest the fact that I've become reliant on my phone. Yeah. First thing, where's my phone? Oh God, I've left my phone somewhere. And then you sit and sort of consider it, and it's like, why am I a slave to this damn device? So, the computer I use for business type stuff and for a little bit of news and whatever, but it's the phone. Straight in the morning, BBC, CNN,
yep.
Australian news. Then it's the email. I don't use any social media. I absolutely don't use social media. I don't want to. I don't care whose dog's doing what, or cat, or what their food is, or who's sitting in a first-class lounge somewhere.
How's that supposed to make the dog or cat feel?
Yeah, well, that's right, yeah. The RSPCA, the animal cruelty people are after me for that. But we were growing up. The extent of our travels was literally from Sydney up to what we call the Blue Mountains, just outside of Sydney. It's an hour-and-a-half train ride. Used to be steam trains, which kids in those days, steam trains. Wow, this big thing. And that was the extent of our travel. So I really didn't think about anything like this, nothing. The first excitement I got about travel was one of my school friends. His father was a doctor, and he went to Cambodia. This is in the late 50s, and that was pretty far-fetched in those days to go from Australia to Cambodia, because air travel in those days was very basic. And he went to a place called Angkor Wat. I don't know whether you know Angkor Wat.
I do not.
It's a massive Khmer, Khmer, the Khmer kingdom dominated that part of Cambodia and northern Thailand in those days. And there's actually some beautiful temples in northern Thailand called Pi Mai. Same culture, but absolutely ornate, beautiful stone carved buildings. And Angkor Wat that's the centre of it all. So anyway, this guy came back and showed my friends. And they showed me, there was no video in those days, obviously. It was still black and white photography or whatever. They showed me these ruins in Angkor Wat. And I've got to say that tweaked a sort of really early basic interest to go, geez, there's a lot to see in the world sort of thing. But then there was nothing. We, again, used to travel down to Canberra, and that was the extent of it. So,
What were your kind of, in those times, what were your earlier aspirations, when you're a kid? I want to be a fireman, I want to be a pilot, I want to be whatever.
Going through the early stages of childhood, of course, it was, I want to be a steam train driver. That was a big thing of young kids around steam trains. Oh, yeah, wouldn't it be great to be a train driver, drive a steam train. Later on, really I was more into, sport. I played cricket, pretty decent at that, rugby. Tennis. Didn't do any surfing, body surfing, but not board surfing, even though we grew up, very close to beaches. We were in southern Sydney. I went to school in a place called Cronulla, where there's a big beach area. But at that stage, I wasn't really thinking of expeditions or whatever. And given how difficult it was to travel in those days with air travel and expensive, we weren't thinking further afield. So. Even within Australia, we didn't do a lot of travel.
Did you have any idea how large Australia was at the time growing up?
No.
I don't think most people actually realize how large Australia is and how much landmass of the U.S. you can fit inside of Australia.
basically, continental US is just a little bit bigger than Australia.
Yeah.
Take out Hawaii, take out Alaska. The continental areas, US is still a little bit bigger, but very close.
I didn't realize it until I came to Australia to do a speaking engagement, and I believe one was in Perth and one was in Sydney.
Oh, yeah.
And I figured, oh, we'll just drive, right? I mean, it's Australia. Sydney and Perth are obviously neighboring cities. Perhaps they have an overlapping area code. And I looked at the ticket and I was like, what's this 5-hour flight?
Yeah. Well, when you look at that, when you look at Sydney, Perth, and compare it to New York, Los Angeles, US is a little bit further, but US is a little more squat. Australia has a lot of, north-south, probably more than the US. If you start in Tasmania and go to the top of Cape York, you've probably gone further than you can go in the US, maybe. But
I think you're right. I think in the overlays, it bubbles out both south and north.
Yeah.
So how far is Melbourne from Sydney?
900 kilometres, 600 miles, more
So
or
my
less.
sister was born there, of all things. My dad did an exchange program. He came and taught physical education in Australia for 2 years.
Right, okay. In Melbourne?
In Melbourne,
Yeah.
well, near Melbourne. I know that's where my sister was born. And they worked on a dairy farm, and he grew marijuana and had nothing but great things to say about Australia.
And when was that?
Weed on the dairy farm.
Yeah. When was that?
Well, let's see. She's 47, so I would need our friend Mike Glover to be here to double check me on this math. But
1974.
there you go, 1974.
Yeah, okay.
And so and they left, I think, when she was about 2, so 74 to 76.
Yeah, because, when I first went to university in 1965, there wasn't, we were almost unaware totally of any drugs. We knew there was beer. Australians drank a lot of beer in those days, still do, but probably less because the wine revolution started. So, we drink a lot of wine now. But I can remember my first awareness of drugs was when I was at university. They caught some of the chemistry professors or PhD students or whatever making LSD in the university, and this was a big deal. And I was like, what the hell is LSD? What's this stuff? And, there was no awareness of marijuana or anything. It was, if you were going to get toasted, it was booze, it was whatever. You look at social evolution and the way the world's moved, and, human beings like stasis. We like stasis largely. We like predictability because that means that we can control our environment to some point. We're just talking over there today that the pace of evolution, social evolution now, will mean a lot of discombobulation because people, it's like, how do you deal with quantum computers, AI? We're already struggling. I'm generationally challenged with computers and whatever. I can manage them up to a certain point, and then they frustrate the hell out of me when they, when it's a little systemic problem and I don't know where I've got to press a button or take a tick out or put a tick in, and it's like, what the hell? And, that's, if I go to my son, he'll go, look, you're stupid, Dad. And he'll just go tick, tick, tick. And I go, no, don't do it at that speed. Let me see what you're doing. No. And it's all done, and I'm no further enlightened. It's like,
These are uncannily similar to the conversations I have with my father.
Yeah.
I bought him his first computer.
Yeah.
And he, to this day, struggles to use it.
Yeah. The first computer I bought was 1985, and it was a brand called Compaq, COMPAQ, and the thing was about this big, and it had 64 kilobytes of memory. Everything else was on floppy disks, right? And you look at the irrationality of that now. 64 kilobytes. One of the passing sort of metrics is when Bill Clinton was in the White House, he had a certain amount of access to computer power. A kid on an iPhone now has more. It's gone that far. It's like crazy. Do you know Ray Kurzweil?
I have heard the name before.
Right, he's a brilliant guy, and he wrote a book. The 0 point is near. That's not the right word, but something similar. He's a futurist and a very, very clever guy in terms of technology, and he says that we're about to hit the inflection point on an exponential curve. So an exponential curve, rises at a fairly, benign rate, and then it hits the shoulder of the curve, which is the inflection point. then it goes almost asymptotic, where it just is going vertically. And he reckons we're at that inflection point where technology will change so quickly that the average person will just turn off and be guided by a technological elite or be led by the nose. Or basically, if you look at, we were talking today about reading the fine print on any of these apps that you get. Here's our terms and conditions. Nobody reads them.
Yep.
Buried down in that is, we can do this with your data, we can do that, we can sell it, we can lease it, blah, 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 blah. And eventually we'll just sit there and shrug our shoulders and just be, we'll be like cows being led by a leash.
I feel that a lot of people are already there.
Yeah.
I think we'll be okay because we have guns.
Yeah.
Now,
It
Mike,
is an equalizer.
Well, this is the problem. You guys have got it, because in Australia you cannot own a handgun.
Right.
It is the only people who own handguns in Australia are either in security services, and they're carefully screened. How careful is careful? Or you're a criminal, right? They got them. Nobody else has them. The difference is nobody else is looking for them.
Yeah.
Nobody's sitting there going, we feel disenfranchised, this is horrible. And as we were saying when we spoke today, it's just a matter of different social evolution. Yeah. We didn't have a war of independence. We didn't have a civil war. We didn't have to go out and fight the Indians and blah, blah, blah. We moved out through the Aboriginal population, but, a spear here and a spear there was nothing that was going to stop. So interesting how, social evolution really controls differences between people.
Right.
So.
Mike, you said your dad fought in World War II?
Yes.
Is that right?
Dad went through a difficult era because he was there during the Depression. So my father actually had a really good mathematical brain, not in terms of complex equations, because he never went past, he probably left school when he was 15. He had to because of the Depression. So he and his brothers, his older brothers, had to leave school and go and get some work and try and help sustain the family. But later on, he could manipulate numbers in his head. People would sit there with calculators and Dad would be going, no, that's the answer. He was good. So he went through the Depression. He had fairly basic education, basic jobs. 1941 or 42, when the Japanese invaded New Guinea, and obviously were pushing through New Guinea, they only ended up 40 miles from Port Moresby. If they'd have taken Port Moresby with the airport and whatever, that would have been a place to, attack Australia. They bombed Darwin quite heavily, and it was interesting because Churchill, in those days, we had 2 Australian divisions were fighting overseas in Europe and the Middle East. We had the 6th Division and the 9th Division. And then one division, I think, I forget which division or remnants of it, were caught in Singapore. The Japanese came the way that they weren't expecting. The British were expecting to come and do a sea invasion, and they just came down the Malaysian Peninsula. And they were in a very bad internment camp there that, a lot of our guys, a lot of the British guys died in the internment camps. But Churchill's attitude was keep the Australian divisions fighting up north, let the Japanese take the top end of Australia, and we'll take it back later. Well, fortunately, the Prime Minister of the day went, no, that ain't going to happen. These divisions are coming back to fight where we need them to fight. So anyway, Dad was, I don't think he was even conscripted. I think he volunteered. And they went up. He was a remnant of the 52nd Battalion, but his company were all trainees. They hadn't been trained very long. So they went up, they went onto the Kokoda Trail. His unit was badly cut up by the Japanese. There was another part of that battalion that were proper trained troops. They did better. So Dad's lot fell back. Then he was taken out because he had malaria and scrub typhus and whatever. And then he went back again and was involved with, I believe, something similar to Coast Watchers. They would have guys with, as I said, the fuzzy wuzzies, the local New Guinea people, behind the lines reporting aircraft movement and whatever. So he didn't talk much about it. And the other Dad was the most generous guy you could ever run across. Generous to the point where he'd lend his mates money, and Mum would say, "Well, we're out of money. What's happening?" "Oh, I had to lend my mate a couple of $1,000. He was doing it tough." And my mother would go, "Well, we're not exactly flying here either." Dad would go, "Oh yeah," but he was super, super popular with people because he was just a generous guy. The other connection I had with warfare was my grandfather, who really had a big influence on me, and in terms of respect for people. He immigrated from England, came out to Australia as a 12-year-old, got a free trip back 7 years later as part of an Australian machine gun division that went to the trenches in France. Okay. And he was involved in a couple of the real big trench battles there, and was gassed, was hit with mustard gas that the Germans were using. Repatriated back to London to recover, and because of his lung weakness, he contracted tuberculosis. So he could, when he came home, he could never work again. So we have a thing in Australia called TPI, which is a special pension for totally and permanently incapacitated veterans. And he never weighed more than about 65 pounds. He was, and they said, basically, they predicted he would live till he was 5 years old. He'd live another 5 years, and he lived till he was 75. He was always frail, but he was the most, calm, stable guy you could ever run across, and just a voracious reader. He read and he read and he read and he read, and I saw him as a source of wisdom, so to speak. So I spent a lot of time around my grandparents. We lived in my grandparents' house for the first 10 years because Dad didn't have any money. So my brother was 5 years, or is 5 years younger. So we were brought up in like one bedroom, Mum, Dad, me, and then Peter, and then eventually moved out on what was called a war service loan. They lent veterans a certain amount of money to build a house. So I got very close to my grandparents, and my grandmother was also a strong influence. She was of Irish descent and quite feisty, and because my grandfather couldn't work, then she went out. She was the breadwinner, and she was a suffragette. You know what suffragettes are? No. They were the women that went out and demonstrated in the streets for the voting rights for women.
Oh, okay.
So she was very active in that, and then she became a member of the Labour Party, and I mean a very strong member of the Labour Party, and she was at all sorts of meetings. Now, she wasn't well educated, and if Stalin had run for the Labour Party, she would have voted for him. The idea that you would vote for anybody in our Liberal Party or the Country Party, which is the opposition, I mean, she would have shot you. I mean, she was like, woof. So I was, as a teenager, I was the oldest grandchild living in Sydney. I had cousins, but they lived elsewhere. So she bought me a dinner suit at 15 or 16 years old, and I used to be taken to the Labour Party ball, and you'd meet the Prime Minister or the State Premier or whatever. So that was sort of a interesting milieu that we grew up in. Yeah. But yeah, my grandfather, he used to talk. Dad didn't talk much about the war. If you asked him, he was just saying, it wasn't a lot of fun. My grandfather also said that. He said trench warfare, as you know, that's that trench warfare. You're in muddy friggin' trenches, and this over the top in charge, and you're going through barbed wire, machine gun, heavily encased machine gun areas. Like, who didn't learn strategy? It's like, this is unbelievable. And they still had in France, mounted regiments. Right? Now, certainly in Egypt, we had what was a fairly famous Australian unit called the Australian Light Horse, and they fought up in North Africa, and they attacked, I think it was Turkish emplacements, or maybe German, I forget, at El Alamein. There was a famous battle at El Alamein where the Australian Light Horse, rode in on horses and cleaned up the opposition. But
that's one of the it's kind of a famous military blunder is that they used the light horse in Gallipoli,
Yeah.
correct? But they
No, not in, well, in Gallipoli as well. Gallipoli was a complete screw up.
right. They didn't actually use their horses though.
No,
they just
no,
had
no,
them
they brought the horses.
as regular infantry, and they just got
Well, Ataturk, who was the guy in charge, the senior general for the Turks, who ended up then being their president for quite a while. They had the high positions. And here's these dumb Australian. We've got a thing called ANZAC, which you probably would have heard of, which is the Australian New Zealand Army Corps. So Australia and New Zealand fought, together in a number of wars. But they landed on the beach, commanded by Australian officers, but superior command was the British. The British officers are parked offshore in yachts, directing this ridiculous attempt to take the highlands there, and of course it was never going to happen. The Turks were entrenched, and the Australians, we lost a lot of guys there. Yeah, and the casualties, as you know, in the First World War, the casualties were on all sides: German, French, British, Australian, New Zealand, Canadian. It was carnage.
yeah.
They go over. My grandfather would say, "You go over the top, charge, and then you come back, and there'd be 2,000 casualties. Not all dead ones, but So that's you guys have been through really tough crap. But
Maybe, but comparatively, I can't even fathom that type of warfare.
No.
I mean, I'm sure you guys used to talk about it when we would watch Band of Brothers or stuff overseas, or historical, where the whistle charge, which, for clarity, both sides can hear the whistle.
Yeah.
As the guy's been checking his natural point of aim for the last 7 months, and
yeah.
he racks it round into the chamber, just starts hammering it's like
Human wave.
It's like, what do you think? So you guys hear that whistle. Would you go up the ladder, or would you pretend that you pulled a hammy?
Or you think somebody's just started a football game, Just
But the stories from that, they would go up and come back into the trenches, and then they would maybe dig their trench forward 3 inches.
Yeah.
They were literally fighting for inches, and then it would cover up, and then redigging their trenches, they would find their fucking dead comrades.
Yeah.
But, I'm sorry, what they did and what we were asked to do is like comparing an apple to a geospatial satellite. It's not the same thing.
Yeah.
Well, and you guys were mobile, and you had mobile assets, helicopters, whatever vehicular support you needed.
Satellite support,
and there it's a game of more a cat and mouse. There's guys there. How do we move there? This trench warfare. Well, let's line all your dudes up and our dudes up, and let's just shoot each other and see who's still standing at the end.
Yeah.
And the Germans never really. They did lose the war, sort of, but militarily they weren't wiped out.
Yeah, it was like a popular movement within Germany to end the war, less so than, or more so than a
and then
strategic
the
losses.
Treaty of Versailles guaranteed the Second World War.
Would,
it was like they had a saying: "Squeeze the German lemon until the pips squeak."
Yeah,
and they took away territory, they took away access to coal mines. There was an incredible financial penalty, and all it did was create the situation for Hitler. I always ask the question of the Germans, and the same of the Russians: how did an Austrian end up? Because Hitler was Austrian. His name was Schicklgruber. That was his surname, Schicklgruber. How did he end up being in charge of Germany? And then Stalin, of course, was Georgian. How did a Georgian end up running Russia and murdering millions of Russians and murdering millions of Georgians too, for that matter? Crazy.
Would you say, it's interesting to me, like from the history I know and the movies I've watched, the the attachment to kind of the Commonwealth, the attachment to Great Britain from Australia. Is that something you felt as a kid growing up?
Yeah, sure.
A loyalty to the Commonwealth?
Yeah. Loyalty to, not the Commonwealth per se, but loyalty to, Queen and whatever, because the Commonwealth is just an association of countries and territories that were, colonised basically by Britain. Mm-hmm. We always talk about England, but it was Britain, of course. Britain came together, 300 or 400 years ago. The Scots are trying to unwind that at the moment, of course, and probably ultimately will have some sort of increased autonomy. But we took it for granted when I was growing up. We sang God Save the Queen, and that was our national anthem. The British flag's still up in the corner of the Australian flag. So we just saw that as a natural thing. We didn't really, we weren't down sort of kissing the floor in front of royalty when they arrived or whatever. But there was certainly the older generations, my mother's generation, were more attached. And that attachment, of course, is declining.
Right.
And
I think that's declining even in Britain.
Yeah, well, it is. The Queen's death and Charles ascending to the throne I think it's stopped that descent temporarily.
Yeah.
Now, there is this, the Queen was such a wonderful person, which she was. I mean, she was a pretty incredible figure for her stability and in spite of a lot of challenges.
Yeah.
I think Charles is a good guy. How long will he last? William seems to be pretty stable. Your friend Prince Harry's in the crap at the moment, talking about how many people he killed in
Afghanistan.
Afghanistan.
What did he say? He said
talked
25?
about 25 kills.
He was an Apache pilot and he only killed 25 people? What a chotch.
Yeah,
That's not
yeah.
very good.
Yeah.
I thought he was attached to the Gurkhas.
No, he was an Apache pilot.
He was a helicopter pilot, yeah. But those guys, as well as their actual active military service, they're the honorary colonels for this and the honorary colonels for that, and some of the Princess Anne is the honorary colonel for 2 or 3 different regiments and all of that sort of thing. This will change in Australia. The Queen having died now, there's another push to turn Australia into a republic. For me personally, I don't care. The influence of the British royal family on Australia is minimal. Constitutionally, they're still the head of state for Australia. They never act that way.
For a day-to-day...
Day-to-day, or even not even day-to-day, year-to-year, the Governor-General and the state governors who literally, in theory, represent the Queen, she does, she used to, now Charles, of course, would appoint them, but she always appointed who the government said, we want this dude, or this lady. So, will it happen? Yeah, it'll happen. Canada changed its status. The Queen's, or the King now, still has a role, but I think I can't remember what they did, but they reformed their constitution so that was less of a direct thing. So,
For you, so going back to more of you, like we're talking, did you think you would be here when you were a kid? What do you think was, the book over there, Anthony Bourdain, he's like a role model of mine in his life, and he talks about he ate an oyster. And that was the point in time when he knew he was a food guy, right? And a travel guy.
Yeah.
What do you think that was for you in the beginning?
As I said, I traveled very little. I did a university degree between 65 and 69.
What'd you study?
Physics and mathematical physics.
I was going to study that too, and then realized I was stupid.
Yeah. Well, I actually graduated, but I still went, I'm stupid. So I finished that, and I was on a teachers' college scholarship. In other words, they were paying for the university tuition fees, and I was getting paid, I don't know, $25 a week or something. And part of the deal there was, when I finished the university degree, I had to do a year in teachers' college learning to be a teacher. So I got about 3/4 of the way through that, and I was like, this ain't for me. People had come with their lesson plans, and we did prac teaching. We went out to schools, and the others would all be sitting there doing the lesson plans, and I'd be looking, going, "What? You've got to do this?" And so, about 3/4 of the way through it, the guy in charge of the teachers' college said, "Mike, we need to have a meeting." He said, "Do you really think you want to be a teacher?" And I said, "No." And he said, "Well, would you be open to resigning from teachers' college?" And I said, "Yes, as long as you give me next fortnight's paycheck." Yeah. So I did that, and I can remember thinking, okay, how am I going to tell my mother this? And she was not an overbearing woman at all. She was 5'2", weighed 100 pounds on a good day, and very kind and loving mother. But I thought, what am I going to do? So I remember sleeping on the beach during the day when I was supposed to be at university, and eventually I went and told her, okay, look, I resigned, and I'd met a New Zealand girl at that stage, and I thought, I'm going to go over to New Zealand and see her. And it was back in the good old days where you exchanged, friendship or a little romance or whatever by mail. I'd write a letter and send it, and then a week later you'd be checking the mailbox every day looking for something back. Then she'd send something back and some photos. So I went over to New Zealand, and there were a couple of seminal events right here. I went to New Zealand, saw her, met her family. Her mother didn't like me at all, right? Mainly because I turned up to the front door barefooted, because we used to go around the streets barefooted. It was just considered normal. And she was a much younger wife of a very successful businessman who owned fishing rights out in what's called the Chatham Islands, which are out to the east there. They caught fish and lobsters, and he was Italian, and she was a princess. Everything was around her and whatever. So she took it immediate. And I've got to say, I was a pretty reasonable person. I wasn't particularly aggressive or whatever, but she took one look barefoot, and so that wasn't going to go anywhere. But to try and sustain a bit of the relationship, I lived with her brother, and I got a job, and that job cured me forever of working anything like that. It was in a lead smelting factory, and it was a very small factory, and they used to smelt the plates in batteries, car batteries. So
horrible.
It was, well, I'll tell you, there was one guy that was even more horrible. They would bring in all these car batteries. This Greek fella used to sit outside just under a canopy. He'd be dressed in full clothing to avoid acid, and he'd sit there and chop the rubber off the side of the batteries. Right? And there's bloody acid going everywhere. And he'd sit there day in, day out. There'd be storms, because Wellington's known as windy Wellington. You get a lot of winds through there. So this guy would be sitting there all day chopping this. He'd have acid burns, and there'd be a bit of acid burn up here. Then the plates from the batteries would come into where we were, and there were two of us, and the guy in charge used to load these plates from the batteries into the smelter, which is like 110, 120 degrees, and then it would melt, and we'd pour it into ingots. But you'd get lead, if it hit any moisture, the lead used to spit, so you'd have holes through the clothes, holes in your legs. And once a week they'd test us for lead poisoning. Mm-hmm. And the guy who drove, there was another guy who drove a forklift, he had lead poisoning but just kept working. And then once we got 12-hour shifts, right? So I'd get up at 6 in the morning, take the train out, which was an hour. Then there was no bus. It was a 20-minute walk to the factory. End of the 12-hour day, you'd go back. And, seeing the girlfriend didn't happen. Yeah. You get back and just, grab a food and go to sleep. And once a week, they'd shut the smelter down, and there was what we called the bag room, where all of the exhaust coming off this process went through this bag room to try and catch all the lead particles, and it would cake the inside of this particular area. So they paid us like $3 an hour extra to put on a respirator, crawl into this little space with a little jackhammer, a little hydraulic thing, and cut all this bloody caked up lead dust in there. And I used to volunteer for that just to make this $3 an hour. Then you got 15 minutes to shower. That was, you got 15 minutes, go and shower. And I did this for, many months. And I thought, this ain't going to be me. So just about this time, the guy came to me and said, we're going to start a night shift, and we're going to make you the night shift foreman. Night shift foreman was going to be me and one other guy, so it was and it was just at that time that you were talking about Bourdain eating the oyster. My mother was worried that I was going to turn out absolutely a useless piece of whatever, and she saw an ad in the newspaper for geophysicists to go to Antarctica. Right? It was what was called ANARI, the Australian National Antarctic Research Expedition, which is based in Tasmania, down in Hobart. And they're the ones who staffed the Australian bases. So they're advertising for geophysicists. So my mother wrote me a letter, and I got it, and she said, look, just want to let you know, I've applied for you to go to Antarctica. And I looked at it and went, yeah, that's cool. We'll see what happens. So the next time I went into the lead smelting factory, and he said, well, we're going to make you the shift foreman. I said, you know what, mate, I'm out of here, thanks very much. I've got a university degree, and I'm not going to be smelting lead. But what that taught me was never again. Yeah. Now, I don't denigrate that job, and there's people who do it, and we need it, and whatever. This is the thing, you guys are, come out of the military, but you're adventure people. I mean, military's adventure, let's face it. It's venture at the cutting edge where life is.
Whether you want it or not.
Whether you want it or not. The risk is there the whole time. As you said, you charge down the inside hall of a place and suddenly there's a machine gun nest at the other end. It's not the adventure that you really want, but it's there.
It's the adventure you're getting.
It's the adventure you're getting. And the thing there is that we need, and I appreciate and respect all of the people who do the daily humdrum jobs. Because they provide the structure, and idiots like us who want to not have the stability can play around on the edges, and again, respectfully, because the structure's in place. You've got a lot of people who get up and go to work every day, man the fort, and the rest of us are sort of, we're like little pimples out on the edges there. Mm-hmm. But she said she's applied, and then I got a letter back saying, look, come and do an interview. So I went and did an interview, and they chose two of us. There were two positions. And this is, you guys have been through it as well. There's, times in your life that links into another time. And people often say, oh, how did you do all this? Just, casual, opportunistic links. This happens and that happens, and there's a young fella here, Anton.
But you said yes, and you took the opportunities.
Well, to young people, occasionally they say, "Oh, I'd like to do what you've done." And I said, "Well, you can't do what I've done exactly, nor what you've done. You can't recreate an exact sort of path. Paths are going to move around and circumstances are different." But I said, if I can give you one piece of advice that I think is reasonable, when you walk up and there's a door, go through. Have a look on the other side, because a lot of people go up to the door and think, oh, not sure what's out there. There could be, some danger or whatever. At least go through, because the same as you chaps have done, you go through and sometimes it's a complete screw-up. And you think, oh, geez, I wish I hadn't gone through this door. But
you just back right out and slowly
slowly sort of backpedal.
Hope you didn't leave anything in that room for somebody to find.
Well, you talk about backwards, just a little tiny sort of, it always reminds me of this. The emblems on the Australian coat of arms, right? One is a kangaroo and one is an emu. An emu, it's like an ostrich.
Yes.
Right? And ostriches are very interesting because in every continent, this shows continental drift, we have ostriches, right? We have emus. Africa has ostriches. And in South America, here in Patagonia, they have a bird called a rhea. Same thing. And they're all interrelated. And they're really a very good example of continental drift, where, because these things can't fly, so they haven't migrated via flight. So anyway, I met this other guy. I've got a really bad memory sometimes for names, but there's names that just pop up. So this guy's name was Josko Petkovic. He was the other guy. And we both wanted to go to Mawson, which is the Australian base in Antarctica, around there. The other place was MacQuarie Island, this sub-Antarctic island. We threw dice or drew lots or whatever. He got Mawson, I got MacQuarie Island. So I went and did some work outside of Perth. There was an observatory there called the Mundaring Seismic Observatory, detecting earthquakes and all that sort of stuff. And then off I went on a little ship called the Neladan, this little Danish vessel that used to resupply the Australian bases. We landed on MacQuarie Island, and I spent another 13 months there.
Was that your first time off the continent?
First time off the continent, yep. Well, no, second, because I've been to New Zealand. Yeah, but same thing.
I'm not going to tell anybody.
Don't tell anybody.
Yeah.
Yeah, the girls here are talking about where the Western Isles of New Zealand, and we say they're the seventh state of Australia. So there's this. There's a lot of jostling between Australia and New Zealand.
And how old were you the first time you got to Antarctica?
Well, the sub-Antarctic, that was 71, so I was 24.
Okay, pretty young.
Yep, so...
And 13 months there.
13 months, we got dropped, we got picked up. There were 16 of us, 16 guys. They wouldn't let women be on any of the bases in those days.
That's so weird. I wonder if there was a reason for that.
Yeah.
Not like it would have caused any problems.
No, not at all. There would have been no knife fights over the ladies or whatever. And no pregnancies. And,
yeah.
So we were 16. Within about 6 weeks, we were 15. One of the guys just on a Saturday afternoon outing around. MacQuarie's like a big ridge. It's actually an underwater mountain pushed up. And then there's a flat isthmus where the base was, and then there was a headland. This guy was walking around the headland, decided to go up the cliff with another guy. Boink. Fell off. So we were sitting there enjoying a Saturday afternoon. It was one of the rare days where it was calm and sunny, because that's in the roaring 50s. So the weather there, you can have 6 seasons in a day sort of thing. It just changes and windy. The second guy came racing around. Look, Brett's fallen off the cliff, and so we went over the top and down. And the doctor, who had a bad leg, took ages to get there. So 2 of us got there first, and he was wedged in a rock, in between 2 rocks. And
Alive or dead?
Well, we didn't know. As it turned out, the doctor said when you got there, he was dead. But we didn't know that. It's like you're trying to feel for a pulse and thinking, I don't know. So I gave him mouth to mouth, and the other guy was giving him chest compressions. Now, as it turned out, his chest was massively damaged because he'd fallen. And but we tried, and then after a couple of minutes, it was clear he was dead. So the funny side of it, which is not really funny, he got put in a bag and put in the chicken freezer, and stayed there for like 2.5 months.
Yeah.
And the funniest thing that came out of that, this is a super windy place, and we had big aerials because it was in the days of radio. You'd be trying to send back messages, right, try 15 megs, no, that's no good, drop down to 11 megs, no, that's not good. And everything that came in was Morse code. There was no fax, there was no... So we're relatively cut off. And so...
I wouldn't say relatively. You were very cut off.
Yeah, we're very cut off. We're on an island 23 miles long and 1.5 miles wide. That's it. Wow. Right, and we got the base, and there were huts down the island, which was fantastic, really basic, but we went out a lot. And on that island, and this is what... There were several events that basically trained my life, so to speak, or pointed in a certain direction. One was there were 4 million penguins on this island, and 4 different species, and one species only exists on that island, royal penguins. And the biggest rookery was right down the southern end, and we used to hike down there. Tough hiking, it was up and over, and up on top there it was pretty boggy. And it had until I saw Vincent here, it had the best toilet scenery I have ever seen, because there was this, sort of a structure with no door, and you sit on the crapper there, and there were 1 million royal penguins right there. And to get down, you had to go down a scree slope, so all this loose rock. And that used to be one of the great things to do, because you'd have to run down this scree slope. You know what it's like, running down a sand dune.
Yeah.
You're jumping your legs and whatever. But this, you sit out there. It was a privilege to go and crap there of a morning, because you'd sit and look out and go, who else is in the world crapping, watching 1 million penguins?
Yeah. Absolutely nobody is the answer to that.
That was the biggest royal penguin rookery in the world, still is. But we had king penguins, the big, second biggest, but those beautiful orange colours. So we had a couple of big colonies of those. And we had an absolutely overwhelming rabbit population, all right, because the sealers used to go to this island and boil down elephant seals. There were about 300,000 elephant seals that used to, mate all around the place. And so the sealers used to catch penguins and seals and put them in boilers and get the oil. And of course, as a food source, they brought rabbits. Well, there was quite a lot of hedge land, sort of whatever. Well, you know what a rabbit's like. They reproduce whenever, 20 times a year or whatever it is. But there was the most amazing rabbits of blue rabbits and sort of red rabbits. The fur colour was unbelievable. So we did a lot of rabbit shooting because the Tasmanian government who controlled it, even though it's an Australian federal government possession, Tasmania controls it. So they sent down a guy for the summer who was a shooter. So we used to go out with him and it was just bang, 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 bang. Subsequently, they've done the cleanup. 20 years ago, they've got rid of all the rabbits. They introduced the same virus that they introduced into Australian rabbits. There used to be a thing called myxomatosis, and then they changed that to another virus that they could introduce onto rabbits that would kill out the...
They spread it themselves.
Yeah,
Interesting.
They spread it themselves. And there was... there were wild cats. Cats had got off ships and whatever. And there were... that used to... A lot of the birds there nest on the ground. So it used to be an open smorgasbord for these damn things. But they've cleaned all that up. So down I go. We're there, and this was the crucial oyster that Bourdin ate. There was a little expedition ship, which was the first expedition ship to run trips to Antarctica and all over the world, the Arctic and all of these remote islands, called the Lindblad Explorer. And it was put together by this Swedish guy who lived in Connecticut, or just outside of New York, called Lars Erik Lindblad, who was Swedish. And Lars was a travel visionary. And to the end of his life, he was the same. He was a big, guffawing, great guy. But his vision was to explore these remote places around the world, especially Antarctica. And he actually ran his first couple of trips down there before that he got this specific dedicated vessel. He chartered Chilean cargo ships out of out of Punta Arenas, and took them down. People were in cargo ships. But he convinced a company called Swedish America Line to build this. It was 75 metres long, 100 passengers, ice strengthened, Zodiacs on board for landings and all of that sort of thing. And that started in 1970. And in 1971, I'm on this base, and Antarctic vessel tourism is mainly out of the bottom of South America because it's a lot closer to the peninsula, sometimes out of the bottom of Australia or New Zealand. So in this particular year, he brought the Lindblad Explorer to go to the Ross Sea, down to McMurdo, the big American base, and you've got Scott's Two Hearts, Shackleton's Hut, a lot of penguins, Mount Erebus, beautiful scenery, superb scenery. So anybody going down from Australia or New Zealand goes through the sub-Antarctic islands. So the New Zealanders have got the Auckland Island, Campbell Island, Snares. Australia has, and all of them have got penguins, right? And some of them species that only appear on that island. There's a little island called Snares. It has a Snares crested penguin. And MacQuarie, of course, is probably the best of all of them in terms of just its, in that area, its diversity of wildlife. So in comes this little expedition ship to visit us, which had never happened before because this base had been going for quite a while. So on board are Swedish stewardesses. There's a lot of passengers, many of them old, but there's some cuties in there as well. So here we are, deprived young males. In comes this boat. They invite us out, so we go out and cause bedlam, and we're drunk as newts, and they're trying to get us off at the middle of the night. Excuse me, making announcements. Will all base personnel please go ashore? Half an hour later, will all base personnel please go ashore? Where are the base personnel? Not sure. Sort of thing. So they did it a 2-day trip, and I remember one particular lady who obviously interfaced with somebody on board on the base, and I can remember up the flagpole the next day was a pair of panties flying, and all of us walking past. I wonder who got lucky. But and they came again. They did a second trip. So same thing. So this Lindblad Explorer was suddenly focused in my mind, and I thought, wow, that's cool. Gee, that's cool, because we'd spoken to the young lads running the Zodiacs and all that sort of thing, and the crew. So it sails off. I go back to Australia. I live in Canberra for 3 years, working as a geophysicist for the government, and just was getting bored with that. But at the same time, we partied like banshees. We just partied and partied and partied. This is where I bought the Chev Corvair, this crazy vehicle.
What was the book that was written about that?
Unsafe at Any Speed.
Unsafe at Any Speed.
Ralph Nader.
Yeah.
This is when you were Daddy Cool.
This is where, well, as I said, I came back and, I was a pretty clean-cut young fella. We got down there, it was no point cutting your hair or shaving, so I grew a full beard. I had hair halfway down my back. And when I got back, I used to go with a headband just to keep the hair out of my eyes. And of course, we landed, same ship picked us up, took us back to Melbourne, and my mother and father came down. And I can always remember Mum, who, as I said, was a little lady, red hair, and she was scanning the boat as we docked, looking for me, going, I could see her saying to my father, I can't see him, where is he? And I'm like this. So I get down, and my mother's like, oh, what have you done? I said, I grew it. And my father was, fairly succinct in what he used to say. And he just looked at me and went, Jesus Christ. So for 3 years, it was like, when are you going to get your hair cut? When are you going to get your hair cut? No, I'm not going to do it. So I decided, stuff this, I'm going to keep it. Why not? And, I got accosted by people in, the pub's toilets, we call, in those days, disrespectfully, gay guys were called poofters, right? And
sometimes they still are.
Sometimes they still are, yeah. And I've got a number of gay friends, and they're great. I've got nothing against it whatsoever, nor do I have the right to have anything against it. Anyway, so we lived there, we partied. Then eventually I thought it's time to move out.
How old at this point?
27.
Okay.
Yeah. And basically thought, okay, we're going to travel. And it was a standard practice in those days for Australian young people to travel to Europe. They used to go to London and go to Earl's Court. Earl's Court was like this massive Australian and New Zealand young people. That was sort of their stamping grounds. Drink beer, party, chase women, and then try and do a bit of Europe. So we were going to go for a year. We said, okay, we'll go away for a year. Okay, good. So we departed in a ship because you couldn't, nobody could afford to fly. So it was a ship that ran Sydney to London.
How long's that journey?
Oh, a month.
Fuck.
Yeah. So we get on it. It goes Sydney, stops in Fiji for a day. So all good. Now, this was, you talk about parties back at home. This was just every night, drinking, party, trying to, chat up the chick, so to speak. And
the panties aren't going to run themselves up the flagpole.
No, exactly. but we used to do stupid things. You look back on your life and go, I had to develop a friendship with a guy there who was a fairly small guy. We'd be drunk down the back deck, and I'd pick him up in my arms and then go over the side of the ship, hanging on by one arm, and this guy going, let me down. No, it's all right, mate, it's all right, yeah. And then you look back and go, why do you do these things? The adrenaline, the testosterone, all that sort of stuff. We then went to Acapulco, And I nearly died in Acapulco by walking across the street looking in the wrong direction, and a friggin' Mexican bus almost literally pulled up sort of inches away because I'm looking in the wrong direction. And then our plan was to get off in Panama, and we were going to do a short backpacking trip in South America and then continue on to London later. Everybody who was there on board was basically going to London. So we get to the front end of, the Pacific end of the Panama Canal. That's good. We go through the Panama Canal. Cristobal Colon, which is on the other end of the canal, we get off there. So there's three of us, myself and two friends, one of whom was the brother of my girlfriend at the time. So we get off, and it's like we've come out of Sydney, which, is a pretty hospitable place, nice place to live. And here we are in Cristobal Colon, looking around going, what the hell is this? It's sort of, we're down in the poor part of town, and everything looked threatening, and it was obviously, we'd never seen poverty like that. And the thing that really freaked me out the next day, just temporarily, was we went to the market, and there must have been 100 vultures sitting on top of the market, just staring down. It was like, Jesus. So we quickly decided Panama was worth a day, and that was it. So we climbed on an aeroplane and went to Ecuador. And then we started what was meant to be a year, ended up 3 years backpacking around South America.
Wow.
Just moving around. We went out to, and it was in the early days where you lived on $5 a day, literally, $5 a day, $2 a night hotels, really crappy, concrete dungeons. But there was, what was great in those days, there was a travelling entourage, in the sense of there were people from all over the world with their backpacks. And so they're all living in these, decrepit hotels and eating in the same cheap restaurants, and people passing on information. Oh, by the way, when you go there, there's this hotel, it's $1.50. It was like, now, kids are like, well, okay, where's the 3-star, 4-star hotels? Some people still do it on the cheap, but not many now. This is the other thing that's gone up in the world for all of us, is expectation.
Yeah.
And it's what's killing the environment is expectation. I expect that I can have, and I can have, and I can have, and I want this, and I want that. So as a species, we're really getting into a very challenging era where the people in the third world have expectations as well, because they can look at their, you've got the Maasai warrior out there in the middle of nowhere with his cell phone, looking, going, oh yeah, well, look, I'm out here herding cattle with a spear, and there's a lion over there. I'm eating, their Maasai's standard meal is blood taken from the neck of the cow and milk. And they mix it. Right? And of course, for a Maasai, his wealth is how many cows he has. Right? And they use that as a sustenance food source. They never kill the thing and eat the meat, but they take the milk and the blood and mix it around and whatever. So here's a Maasai. His expectations are, gee, I like these Ferraris, so, and here we are at the same time, I drive around on a Toyota Corolla and, gee, it'd be nice to have a Ferrari, which we don't need. So it's all expectation, privilege, whatever. So we get off, so we travelled very, sort of frugally, and we went out to the Galapagos Islands at that stage. So we flew out, and there's almost no tourists. Now you go out there, there's thousands and thousands of tourists. We're doing all right for time?
We are
Yep.
plenty on time.
Yep.
I have hours of
Well,
recording ability.
so we go out to Galapagos, and again, we find the cheapest joint in town and settle in there. And there was an interesting little group of Germans who had settled in Galapagos not long after the Second World War. And they were out there, these German families, basically not running the show, but they were the ones who, were the entrepreneurs, so to speak. I remember one, the main guy, Gus, you still sort of picture him, who was a real, German entrepreneur with 1,000 tales of what it was like to live in the early days on Galapagos. So we chartered a little fishing boat, really basic little fishing boat. You live down in the hold in a hammock and whatever. Went out around the Galapagos, and that was a really, the wildlife out there, as you know, Darwin and his theory of origin of the species didn't just start there, but that's where he saw the finch species, looked at the different species of finches on each island and went, they're all the same family, but they've adapted to the specific conditions, so their beaks were different. So some were seed eaters, some were plant eaters, etc. And that, amongst other things, that started him thinking about speciation and evolution of the species. So then we went back and we were up in the highlands there in Quito. Quito's up in the mountains, and you have the Quechua people up there. They wear the blankets, whatever, and that was a beautiful place. And Ecuador's a mess now, absolute mess with drug barons, really screwing up. They're in their third state of emergency. I don't know whether you guys read a lot. They've had their fourth or fifth prison riot, where gangs are shooting or killing each other. 150 people dead.
Yep.
Gang. You almost think, well, one gang killing another gang. Gee, what do we do about that? Probably not a lot. But anyway, it's out of control. So then we went down to Peru. We went to Bolivia, and then we went down and got to Chile and ended up staying then in Santiago for 6, or probably 8 or 9 months. Got jobs teaching in a school there, played rugby, had fun, drank wine. It was just after Allende was kicked out and Pinochet came in, the military coup. So it was pretty hard times there. It was a curfew at night, and often machine guns, and you'd hear a bomb and all this sort of thing. So we stayed there, and Chile was a great place, and there was a fantastic black market for dollars. So we could live way above our station in life with drinking good wine and whatever because of a 600 or 700% black market. People desperate to change. So we stayed there. Then we continued on down south, went around in the Tierra del Fuego, went up then through Argentina, stopped in Argentina in Buenos Aires, and stayed with friends from the Australian Embassy. Didn't work there, but I learned to fly there. Learned to fly small planes because it was $12 an hour because of black market again. Mm-hmm. So we had a great time there, and then eventually went back to Chile, and then we went up through Uruguay, went to Paraguay, Uruguay, and then up to Brazil, and this is where it all reconnects. Along the way we met this English girl, and we got to Rio de Janeiro at the same time. And we had a little fun there, and we were ready to go back to Australia because we'd run out of money. We had no money. So we're out in a pub one night in Ipanema, and everyone's hooting away and we're drinking. And this semi-drunk Irishman, who was the size of a leprechaun, came up to us and said, "And what do you guys do?" And we said, "Oh, well, we're backpackers, and we're about to go back to Australia." And why are you going back to Australia? I said, "Well, we're out of money, and we can't crimp too much more." And he said, "Well, have you got any education?" And we said, "Well, yeah." And I forgot, I'd hooked up with my girlfriend. She came to Peru, and then we were travelling together. And the first thing she said to me, her mother and father were really lovely people, and they put up with me with the long hair and the beard and whatever. Which, by the way, I'd cut my hair. My mother kept saying for years, get your hair cut, I'll pay for it. So when we decided to leave for South America, I figured having long hair in South America and suspicion of drugs and whatever, probably smarter to cut it off. So I went one day to my mother, said, give me $10. She said, "What do you mean give you $10? I said, "Give me $10. She said, "I'm not giving you $10. I said, "I'm going to get my hair cut." Well, the money was out of her purse in a flash. And so I sat there while this guy's cutting it off, and it was like, because I was used to, the headband, you wash your hair and brush it and all that sort of shit, and suddenly it was like, you're almost semi-naked. So my girlfriend's parents, were really smart, educated people, really nice people. Anyway, they expected that when Roz came over to Peru, she said, "Oh, Mum and Dad thinks it's so romantic. We're going to get married up in a little Peruvian church in the Andes." And I was like, What? Sorry? Come again? Oh, yeah. Well, they're expecting us to get married here. And I said, I'm not going to get married here. If I'm going to get married at all, it's going to be back home with my family and whatever. Anyway, that never happened, fortunately. So we get to Buenos Aires, we lived there, and it was pretty tough there too, because there was, this is when there was a lot of revolutionary people attacking police stations and all this sort of stuff. So, there was again curfews, and you had to be very careful where you went and how you went, sort of thing. So we stayed there for a while, and then, as I said, we've now moved up to Brazil. We get to Brazil, this Irishman says, well, look, I'm the president of this English Language Institute called CCAA, it's Centro Cultura Anglo-Americana. And he said, we've got, 35 English-speaking places or English-teaching places, and, we like to have a variety of English-speaking teachers from different countries, different accents, different vernacular and whatever. So he said, we'll give you a job. So, oh, great. So anyway, we got jobs, both of us teaching English, and we met same pub, we met a English guy who was there. There's a thing called the British Council, which is like, Alliance Francaise. The French government have an organisation called Alliance Francaise that's all around the world. It's meant to expose French culture, French language and whatever. And the British had a thing called the British Council. It was to incentivize people in other countries to learn about Britain, learn the language and whatever. So he said, British Council pay for my apartment, it's got another bedroom, come and stay with me. So this, in a strange way, all interconnects. So this English girl that we'd met, she comes there, so they start having a relationship, right? So they were like, okay, we're going to go back down to Argentina, to Ushuaia. Okay, great. Long story short, they come back and said, oh, how'd it go? It was really great. And she said, oh, and by the way, I got a job on a little expedition ship called the Lindblad Explorer. And I went, Lindblad Explorer? I know Lindblad Explorer, because it had come through MacQuarie Island. And she said, oh, it's going to be here in 10 days. It's coming up the coast and then it's going to go up the Amazon. Why don't you try and get a job on the ship? So I went, oh, shit, okay. So we did a little sort of asking around and found out where the representative from the company, Lindblad Expeditions, was based in East 55th Street in New York. It wasn't Madison, Lexington and 55th. The office was there. And so this dude, Chris Powell, who was the most socially inadequate person I've ever met, he was like, he'd been born in Argentina, he was English, born in Argentina, and he couldn't look you in the eye. He was like, and he was always rubbing his hands, but he was a really nice guy, but you see him as a social animal, it's like, holy shit, something's wrong here. So we find out where his hotel was, and I ring him, and his immediate thing was, how did you find my name? How did you know where I... And it's like, oh, okay. So we go down to the ship, get on board and have a look around and think, gee, this is pretty cool. And there's a couple of young American guys there who were Zodiac drivers, lecturers. What's it like on board? Oh, it's fantastic. We go to all these remote places, really fantastic. Oh, yeah, that's cool. So Chris comes around and says, well, actually, we're not interested in you, me. We would be interested in your girlfriend because she studied biology. We don't have a lot of use for physics. Okay. Anyway, Roz said, well, I'm not going by myself. So Chris said, well, you know what, we don't have a job, but give me your address. So that's good. So we then decided, we were finished in Brazil. We went up the Amazon, on one of these bloody local boats where the hammocks are stacked three deep, and there's, insects all over the place, and, you wake up every morning, something had bitten you, and you wondered what it was. We went up to Manaus, which is at the junction of the Rio Negro, and it's where that, the black water meets the coloured water there. And we stayed there, and it's got a famous opera house back in the rubber days, because, Brazil was the source of rubber. And so back in those days, they built this ornate opera house in the middle of the bloody Amazon jungle. And that's still there. So, we had a look at that. We did a few things. Then we went up the Rio Negro then, and up the what's called the Rio Branco, so the Black River, then the White River, and that runs up to Guyana. So along the top of South America, you got Venezuela, what used to be British Guyana, and then Dutch Guyana, and then French Guyana, right? So there's the three. It's now independently, they're all independent. Dutch Guyana is now Suriname. French Guyana, funnily enough, is not independent. It's still a French colony, and that's where they launch the Ariane 5s, launch from there. So anyway, we go into British Guyana, and then we went across to Suriname, or Dutch Guyana in those days, and then across to French Guyana, traveling. And then we got back to Venezuela, and I used to get my mail sent to me to the embassies. So where there was not an Australian embassy, we'd get the British embassy. So the mail could go there, they'd hold your mail. So I went into the Venezuelan embassy, and the lady said, "Oh, you Mike McDowell?" And I said, "Yeah." And she said, "Oh, well, the international police have been looking for you." And I went, "Oh, okay." And she said, it's to tell you that your mother passed away."
Wow.
And my cousin was high up in the Australian police force, so they didn't know where we were because we'd been out of contact because we're up in these godforsaken sort of places. Beautiful, but a little bit on the edge. So we went back to Australia for the funeral, and while I'm there, along comes a letter from this Chris Powell going, "We can give you a job going to Antarctica, driving Zodiacs on this little expedition ship." So this is where it all circled back. This MacQuarie Island met, this girl comes to stay with, meets us, and she goes down and gets a job, passes on the information. And this is what we were talking about, opportunistic situations. You don't plan, just happens. And so I got this letter, and they weren't asking Roz to come, just me to be a Zodiac driver. And she, at this stage, we'd gone back home. Her parents are not happy. They're not happy that
Because you arrived unmarried?
Yes, we arrived unmarried, and that was a little sort of pressure point. And she said, "Well, what are you going to do?" And I said, "Do you know, I've got to go and, I just want to go to Antarctica because, I'd been to MacQuarie. I knew about Antarctica because, I was in the lottery to go. I could have ended up in Mawson, which would have changed everything. You look at these what ifs.
Yeah.
If I'd have gone to Mawson, I would have never seen the Lindblad Explorer, probably would have come back, got married, lived a suburban life, white picket fence, and probably been happy. Then again, maybe not. So these were these little connecting links, none of which were thought out, none of which were planned. Some people plan their lives. I'm going to do this, 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 and this. Mine's been, I wouldn't say chaotic, but it's been, flop here, flop there. So I said, I've got to go, but I'll come back and we'll look at what we're going to do going forward. Well, I never came back. I did come back, and it was obvious this was not going to happen. I'm still in touch with Roz. We still occasionally, every couple of months, she'll ring or I'll ring her, and we'll crack a few jokes and laugh about things and whatever. And I always tell her, "You're really, really lucky that you didn't, you didn't get me. You're really lucky." And I think to myself, I'm really lucky as well. She was really smart and really talented, but it would have been a suburban life. So I go off, start driving, and the first thing, I get on board, and it's like, holy, there's all these Swedish stewardesses, there's all of these visiting people coming on, a lot of, some of them young, some of them a little older, and some very old. The bar's free. I got a free bar bill, so we partied like banshees every night because the passengers wanted to as well. Mm-hmm. And then we're going down Antarctic Peninsula, and it was the only vessel. Right? Now there's 50 tourist vessels.
Wow.
We were the only vessel.
Like specifically Antarctic tourist vessels?
Yes.
Wow.
Yes, we were the only Antarctic tour vessel in the whole of Antarctica. Now we were focused there. Later on, we went to the Ross Sea side as well. But so we did like 5 trips the first year, and there'd be 5 landings a day, and there'd be shore parties, drinking booze, and we could go anywhere. And now there's quite significant restrictions. Those days there was nothing. You didn't have to have a permit. You just went down and did what you were going to do.
Oh, wow.
So again, we often sit with fellow travellers of that time or guys that I work with and go, back in the old days, and my kids go, back in the old days, you stupid old bastard, and was like, no, back in the old days, it was different. Yeah. You look now, they're queued up with ships waiting to land, and they have to wait because you can't put 2 lots of people on the same landing point. And they're lucky to get 1 landing, maybe 2 a day. We used to do 4 and 5. 3 o'clock in the morning, we'd see whales, wake everyone up, get out and whatever. So I started off driving the Zodiacs, and then a couple of months later, we went to Galapagos. And the guy who was the expedition leader, he was going home, and they needed a new expedition leader, so he recommended me, which was a bit of a shock to a number of people because we were the party hounds. So I took over as the expedition leader and did that for the next 6 years. Mm. And, we went all through Alaska, the Arctic, all of the little islands in Micronesia, which in those days were not deculturated. New Guinea, a lot in Indonesia, out through to all the remote islands going out through Indonesia. We did a lot of the Pacific islands, as I said, New Guinea, Solomons, Vanuatu, some of the really remote stuff there, then through to Chile, back down to Antarctica, blah, 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 up the Amazon. We went right up the full length of the Amazon.
What would you say the turnover was on that ship? Like how many crew were on there, and then how often did
crew was 50, and the passengers maximum were 100. It really depended, the changeover of crew or changeover of passengers, normally a couple of weeks. Mm-hmm. Maybe Antarctica used to be a little less, 10 days, 10 or 11 days. If you just went to the peninsula, we spent a lot of time in the Falkland Islands and South Georgia, which for wildlife, is absolutely fantastic. Those trips would be longer. If you did it out of Australia and New Zealand, they were much longer because the distance is much further. But the great thing about doing that side was you got these sub-Antarctic islands, which have different range of wildlife. So all of that really got me into appreciation of the natural environment, wildlife, balance of nature, which we're not very good at. Human beings, we're terrible. We don't understand the integration of nature. We pick out big things. We like big animals. If you talk to people about the specific things like beetles, beetles used to be, as far as I knew before, the most speciated living organism aside from bacteria and viruses and fungi. And beetles are beautiful. You look at some of those horn beetles in Africa and whatever. Now, if you've said to most people, well, gee, it's really exciting, beetles. Most people would go, beetles? Who gives a shit about a beetle? Mm-hmm. Beetles are critical to the environment. Mm-hmm. They reprocess forests. They break down cellulose out of trees. And this is the thing, we just don't understand the integrative nature of the natural environment. We're almost like an interloper. Somehow we developed this big brain that allowed us to sort of separate to some extent. And most people don't see themselves as an animal, but of course we are. Yeah. Clearly we're an animal. And clearly we were originally part of the environment rather than somebody who sits above it. Now, we only sit above it because we think we sit above it. But as we know what's happening now, nature's biting our ass. And one of my hobby horses is people don't understand, nor do I fully either, the deterioration in insect species. We're wiping out insect species by the thousands all the time because of pesticides, habitat destruction. And insects are a part of this integrated, nothing that's evolved doesn't have a place because nature evolves into niches. If there's a bare niche, they'll integrate into it. So, insects are pollinators. It's not just bees. Insects are a food source. As I say, beetles break down cellulose, recycle forests and whatever. And here we are, this big bumbling, mammal, just stampeding our way through. So that experience with Antarctica and a lot of other places, we got into diving, scuba diving very early. And so I've done a lot of scuba diving around the world, and that's another world that's just fantastic. That again is being destroyed, right? With ocean temperatures rising, there'll be adaptation, of course. That's the other thing, that we may wipe out a lot of the corals that we currently enjoy, but nature doesn't leave an empty niche. So something will evolve into that, whatever it is. We're killing 100 million sharks a year. Of course, there's about 200 plus species of shark. We all think of tiger sharks, great whites, blue sharks, and whatever. And fisheries are so destructive because you don't catch one species. They drag nets that just the bycatch that's just tossed back.
They don't discriminate.
They
That's
don't
for sure.
So there you've got the loss of one of the top predators. The top predators probably killer whales. Nothing predates on killer whales. Killer whales will predate on other whale species. They'll predate on sharks occasionally, but nothing attacks a killer whale. So they're the top predator. But the sharks are also way up the top there. So you get rid of them, what do you end up with? Maybe squid. Because squid are predatory, but it's a different sort of you wonder what's going to how is nature going to evolve into this? Because if human beings totally disappeared, the planet wouldn't give a rat's razoo. Not that the planet has a consciousness, but
Might be a touch happier, actually.
yeah. Well, all of the cities in the world, everything that we built, eventually would just be overgrown. It'd still be there. You still have concrete structure. That Angkor Wat I referred to was, I think, the 12th century or the 13th century, and it's still there. There's trees growing through parts of it and all that sort of thing. So anyway, all of that exposure to the wildlife that I was very lucky to experience, it made me sort of probably a little bit more aware than many people of, just the beauty of nature, and just as I said, this integrative situation with nature, where we've got to consider ourselves as part of this. Not, of course, religiously we're taught that, certainly Christianity. I was brought up a Catholic. I went to a Catholic school. The moment I left school, literally the moment it was like, this ain't for me. I respect it. I respect that, many people believe in Jesus Christ and Christianity, and Hindu people are lucky because they've got 1,000 gods. You can, and Islam, of course, is a monotheism, as is Judaism, and I respect it, but it just for me personally, it doesn't make any sense.
I fall into the exact same boat.
To me, it's another myth. You create these stories, and it's like, I look at it from a scientific point of view, because I did a second degree in economics and statistics, and then later in life, I went back and did a master's degree in astronomy and astrophysics. I like science, and to me, the laws of physics explain much, and there will be much that remains inexplicable. Because, I've got a friend at the moment saying, how can you explain what comes before the Big Bang? It's like, you can't. It's a meaningless question. The human brain cannot tell you what came before the Big Bang. And somebody said the other day, do you believe in multiverses? I said, well, it's an interesting idea. There's absolutely nothing to prove one way or the other. And, mathematically, some of the, smart scientists are fiddling around with string theory and other theories about multiverses and wormholes and whatever. All really interesting, but in terms of experimentally proving it, it's not going to happen in my lifetime, so I don't really care. But, so that I did that for 6 years. That boat got sold, so I got off in Japan, and a wealthy Chinese guy down in Singapore contacted me, a friend. He said, Mike, I've got a job for you. There's this friend of mine in Indonesia who's building a boat, for 30 passengers to run out of Bali. And he needs somebody like you who has had the experience of, being on board and operating. So I went, okay. So I went down to see this guy. He had this dragon of a wife, very good-looking. He was Chinese, Indonesian. She was as well, and she was like the Dowager Empress, sort of, Johnny. These names was Johnny. And it was like, oh dear. Anyway, we went out. There's outside of Jakarta, there's a place called the Thousand Islands, and it's all these little islands, and they're mainly owned by rich dudes. So we go out to this guy's island, and this guy used to love to drink. So he'd have 2 or 3 bottles of wine, and he'd be absolutely toasted. But he was a really nice guy. So he said, well, will you work for me? I said, yeah, but I've got to bring... I'd met a Brazilian girl on board on one of these trips who was... Everyone says their wife or their girlfriend is beautiful. She was friggin' beautiful. And just a lovely person. So we were together for the next 9 years, basically. Off and away, me travelling and whatever. But so Christiana was with me. I said, Johnny, it's me and her, and he said, oh, well, let me think about it. So, Johnny. She got involved. Anyway, they said, yeah, okay. So we lived in Bali for a year, ran this boat out through. If you look at Indonesia, if you go from Java, there's a whole string of islands go out towards New Guinea. Indonesia's got about 18,000 islands. Some of them very small, some of them bigger. So culturally, it's Indonesia was, and still is to some extent, but the changes in the world now, people don't in these sort of places, they don't necessarily wear their traditional clothing, their customs are different. Now the guys running around Bali are all in bloody Western coats and T-shirts and driving motorbikes. It's not the same. And again, this goes back to in the good old days, it was true. Yeah. There was more diversity, there was more cultural interest and whatever. Anyway, each of these islands had their own different culture. I collected weavings, because they used to weave these beautiful textiles. They'd use cotton, the ladies used to spin it, they used to dye it using natural dyes, and then they'd use a thing called a backstrap loom. They'd sit and they've got the sort of bases of the threads there, and they have a big belt round their back, so that's why it's called a backstrap loom. And they'd sit there for hours on end weaving these exquisite pieces of material. Each of those was different. You went to Sumba and then Sumbawa or Flores, and they had all of these. And this is where there was just this cultural diversity. It was beautiful.
How old are you at this point now?
This was, let me think now, this was 84, so now I'm 37.
Okay.
So we spent a year doing that, and it was great. A lot of hard work, but interesting. And we did a lot of diving. So this is where the next step came, because now I'm still working for somebody. And Johnny had this boat that was beautiful sort of inside, but really badly designed, because it ended up, the bow was like 2 feet lower than the stern. So this is a catamaran that used to go around like this, and it was just boom, boom, boom. It was a terribly designed boat. They eventually put sponsons inside and lifted the bow, but it was never a great seaboat, but nice inside. And I was at this stage thinking, well, shit, I can do this. So do I start my own company? And so I did. I started a company called, it's still in existence because I sold it at the end of the 90s, Quark Expeditions. So I went to Johnny and said, well, look, Johnny, you have this period where there's nobody's booked. This is the first year. The guy running it, who's still running the marketing, who's still a very good friend of mine, an American guy from Michigan, who's lived in Indonesia for like 40 years, speaks absolutely fluent Indonesian, better than most Indonesians, and his name's Jack Daniels. So Jack was running the shore side, I'm running the ship and the expeditions or the trips. And I said, well, look, Jack and Johnny, you guys don't have any bookings. How about you charter to me and we'll run dive trips, right? Because we knew, because of the times we spent going through Indonesia on the Lindblad Explorer, we knew these fantastic dive spots in what's called the Banda Sea. So Johnny says, oh yeah, so he gives me this rate. Now, one of my very dear friends, both of them, husband and wife, but the husband passed away about 10 years ago, and Valerie's still in Australia. She's 87 now. She's a legend in Australia for underwater filmmaking. They call her the Shark Lady. She used to feed sharks, and she used to get in the chainmail suit and put fish around and get bitten and all that sort of shit. And Ron was the cameraman. And so she's got all sorts of awards, and she's a legendary person. So they were very close friends. And I said, Valerie, do you think you can go to your mailing list, friends list, and see whether we can get anybody to fill up a dive trip? And Valerie said, yeah, of course we can. So 2 weeks later, we got a full ship. So I went to Johnny and said, how about a second one? Yeah, okay. Valerie took it, 4 weeks now instead of 2 weeks. Filled. So that was the start of Quark Expeditions. So we had 2 fantastic trips. So we ended up running 20 or 22 of these. Bali to Ambon, Ambon back to Bali. Not easy in the middle of the year because you have the southeast monsoon blows. So it's 20, 25 knots, 20, 25 knots. And this friggin' badly made boat, it was rough as hell. So we'd have to crawl up behind these big reef islands and dive. So that was the start of me branching out.
Your first business venture.
First business venture. And, we ran 2 trips and went, wow, it's not bad, the profit's good. So next year, same thing. And then, in subsequent years, I can't remember exactly which year, it was like, okay, now I'll charter a boat in Solomon Islands. We'll do diving there. Then Vanuatu. Then we chartered I chartered a boat out of San Diego, went down to Costa Rica, and went out to Cocos Island, where you get these big schools of hammerhead sharks, which is, you sit on a ledge there at 60 feet, and here's 200 hammerheads just like a ballet, just swimming around. So we ran that. Then we did, we went up, we did Palau, and various other places. But the main thing, the best diving in the world, in my opinion, is eastern Indonesia. You get out towards New Guinea. There's a place called Raja Ampat, which is still legendary. Highest number of species of any dive in the world. They sent guys down for a 1-hour dive. How many species, not only fish, but vertebrates, invertebrates, 350 species in a dive, this sort of thing. Really, really, really rich. And the reason it's rich, because the number of species radiates out in a descending order from eastern Indonesia and New Guinea. That's the most species-rich area in the ocean. And one of the reasons there is during the ice ages, it's very deep in those areas. During the ice ages, all of the, next to Java, the Java Sea, that's shallow. So that was all land. So the water that remained contracted into smaller areas. So guess what happened? All the fish and the species had to contract into that area. And, there were more and more species. So that was the start of it. It built up. We ran some eclipse trips. We did stuff in Baja, California. Then we did some stuff up in Alaska. No, we didn't do that. Then I started to run North Pole trips. So Ken Boric Air, went to them and chartered Twin Otters. And we used to we'd fly to Resolute, which is up in northern Canada. It's on an island called Cornwallis Island. And that's like a big local centre for the Eskimos and, sort of logistics. We'd fly from them up on, Ellesmere Island.
I know of it.
Yeah, great.
Take me a little bit to point it out on a map.
Yeah, well, it's a very big island and just adjacent to Greenland, to the western side of Greenland. Because between Ellesmere Island and Greenland, there's these narrow straits that then break out into the Arctic Ocean. So there's a lake up there called Lake Hazen, and they had, a hut there on this frozen lake where you could catch Arctic char for dinner and all that sort of shit. Then we'd fly out of there, we'd have to land somewhere else to get fuel and then go to the North Pole. Land at the North Pole.
Put it down right there in the Otter.
Put it right down on the Otter. Yep. Did that. Did a number of those, and then kept developing. Instead of 1 or 2 trips a year, 5 trips, 6 trips, 7 trips, and then when I'd worked on that Lindblad Explorer, towards the end there'd been 2 new owners. Lars Lindblad was a great visionary, but wasn't probably the best businessman in the world, and he'd more or less gone out of business, set up another little company, but wasn't in the main business. But he was a legendary, visionary, fabulous guy, great raconteur. But once he moved aside, there was space for others, and his son started his own company and did very well. He's still in business. Great trips, great. He had his mother's acumen for business. She was Swiss, and she had she was a really good business person. So. And then there was another crucial element to, making it a little bit better business-wise. So the guy who was the president of this Lindblad, it was called at that stage Salén Lindblad, owned by a Swedish guy called Christer Salén. He sent his very close friend and godfather of his children to run the company in the US. So I worked under this guy, Lars Vikander. When I was running the ship, he was the boss, so to speak. So I break out on my own, and I said to Lars, "Look, I don't want to do the friggin' office stuff. Can I use your people?" And
It's like a back end.
Yeah, because and he said, "Yeah, we can work something out." I think he took a 6% commission on gross, and so then his office staff used to do the bookings, and they used to do the operational stuff, send all the stuff out. And so I could go out and go, "Yeah, we'll do this trip, we'll charter that boat, blah, blah, blah." And it worked really well. So comes beginning of the 90s, there's a new ship built in Japan, right? 164 passengers, really upmarket. And Christer Salén became a co-investor in that boat, along with Mitsubishi, a big investment company in Japan, and Mitsui, I think, another Japanese one. So Lars said, "Right, we've got this one and we're going to sell it." And okay, that's good. And he said, "I want you, Mike, to be the expedition leader on it to get it started off." I said, No, I don't want to do that. And he said, No, you've got to do me a favour. I want you to do that. So I went, "Okay, I'll do it." And then they weren't marketing particularly well. So I thought, So I went to him and said, "Look, you've got some space here. Can I charter one trip?" And it was out of Australia down to, it was out of New Zealand down to Antarctica, the Ross Sea. And he said, "Well, let me talk to the Japanese people." Anyway, he came back and said, "Okay, do you think you can fill it? Because, if you don't, it's a lot of money, you'll lose." And I went, "No, I think I can." So I had a friend in Australia who ran a travel company who was a specialist in South America. So I went to Dennis and said, "Look, we've got the ship. Do you reckon you could sell it in the Australian market?" And he said, "Yeah, I think I can." So 4 weeks later, we had 164 people.
Damn.
And so I went back to Lars and said, "Can I get a second one?" "Oh, no, I don't think so." They don't want to charter. They want to make retail. So a few weeks later, he comes back and said, "No, they'll charter because they're still not selling." So I went to Dennis. "Dennis, do you think we could maybe..." And of course, he's making money on it hand over foot as well. So he says, "Yeah, I think we can." So, 6 weeks later, we got another ship filled. Right? So we got 2 ships, 164, or 2 departures, and that's a lot of profit.
Yeah.
So I'm thinking, wow, this is cool. And then I thought, wow, this is risky because they're still building this boat. Right? This is still in the shipyard being built. Now, the good thing was it was in a Japanese shipyard, right? And you know what the Japanese like for... They're very punctilious. It's going to be finished on this day and this day. But I thought, gee, what if something happened? So by chance, we'd met an insurance guy who then became a lifelong friend, and he was a Taiwanese guy who lives in New Jersey. And Mr. Ting, I went to Mr. Ting and said, "Ting, can I insure against what I call no-show. Something happens and the boat can't come and I can claim the insurance. And he said, Mike, you can insure against anything. It just depends on the premium. Right? He said they'll insure, piano players insure their fingers, for tens of millions of dollars. So he said, yeah. So he said, let me go and see you. And I said, here's the details. So he came back and said, yep, they'll insure against non-delivery, basically for any reason. So I went, great. And he said, how much coverage do you want? And I said, I want $1 million on each departure. And he said, okay, they'll want to see what the revenue is. So I said, fine, well, 164. I can't remember what the price was, but it wasn't cheap. And he said, yeah, okay. So the insurance company said, yes. And eventually it all goes back to Lloyd's of London. Goes back to, and Lloyd's, people think Lloyd's is one company. It's not. It's a bunch of syndicates. And Lloyd's started back in the 1700s where they used to meet in a coffee shop and insure against loss of cargo. But if you go to Lloyd's, there's Lloyd's. It's syndicates, and they put syndicates. The syndicates, many of them take a part of the insurance. They won't take the whole lot. And then there's a reinsurance market where the insurance company gets somebody else to take part of it. So you've got Munich Re and Swiss Re, these big reinsurance companies. So anyway, and I said, well, what's the premium going to be? And he said, $6,000. I went, oh yeah, that's okay, $6,000. Now nobody would touch it for $6,000 now. It'd be 600,000.
Yeah.
But this was fairly new, so
I'm waiting for you to say a day.
Yeah,
or something like that. Yeah.
So that's fine. So I'm sitting there thinking, okay, well, I'm insured. This is good. So the delivery of the ship, when it rolls down the rail there, is scheduled, I forget, October. The Japanese rolled that thing down on the minute, right? They said, we're going to deliver the boat on this day. It's going to be this time. So we all fly over to Japan, and the shipyard was down near Osaka somewhere. So I'm sitting there thinking, this is not bad, so ship rolls down, we go on board, look at it, beautiful, beautiful ship. It's still sailing. It's got another name now, and they've refurbished it, and it's being operated by friends of mine now. So Lars still says, right, you've got to do the first couple of voyages. So yeah, okay, that's good. So I get on this boat in Guam, right, is where it starts, the first one, and we go through the Micronesian islands, the Caroline Islands. So Palau, Caroline Islands, out through that area. Then you come into the Marshall Islands, and then you go down what's called Kiribati and Tuvalu, that used to be the Ellis, Ellis and Gilbert and Ellis Islands, used to be British colony. So we go down there, and everything's good. We go out to Fiji to finish the voyage. Then I was getting off, and they were going to do another couple of trips to the New Zealand subantarctic islands before my Antarctic trip started. So we get near Fiji, and there's a hurricane warning, so a cyclone warning. So we go into Fiji's main harbour, and the local port authorities had closed the port, and so the only way to get people ashore was by tugboat. So we had to take everybody in. This cyclone's coming. Captain takes it out and anchors it in the lagoon. I get into the hotel, and this cyclone hit hard. So, I was in the bathtub inside the bathroom because the front window shattered, and this went on. And next morning, the place was a wreck, the trees down, and a lot of the locals, they've had all the roofs ripped off and whatever. Anyway, I then find out that the ship dragged anchor in the middle of the night. The captain had turned the engines off, which was, most captains would not turn the engines off when you've got a cyclone coming. You keep them running. He's got 2 anchors out, and he goes to bed. The watch officer doing the 12, it's 8, 12, 12, 4, is a fairly junior guy. The chief engineer goes to bed sick. The chief engineer's in bed. The engineer on watch, who was Japanese, was sick, so he goes to bed. So the Filipino motorman's down there, right? So the watch officer looks in, they're checking the radar and starts to see that they're dragging anchor. So he calls the captain comes up. They can't find the engineer, or they look and find the engineer's in bed. They get him out of bed. It takes something like 17 or 18 minutes to start the engines up. And when he goes onto the throttle, the propeller hits the reef, all right, bends the shaft or damages the shaft. So it's now, in effect, incapacitated. There's no shipyard in Fiji. So the only shipyard they could find is down in Sydney, Australia. But it's edging up to Christmas, so you ain't going to get the ship in. So I'm sitting there going, oh, okay, I wonder how this affects me. And then, as the things evolved, it's like, I've got to cancel the first cruise. So I ring Ting, shit, blah, blah, blah. He said, Mike, just be calm. He said, this is exactly what you've insured against. He said, this is an insurable event. I will start the process to make a claim. So, okay, all right, good. And then they're supposed to get it ready for the next cruise. That also gets cancelled. Ting, Mike, don't worry, I will start the process. So I got $2 million out of these insurance cancellations. And we
without issue? Went through no problem?
went through no problem, because it was such a straightforward event.
For 6,000.
For $6,000 on each. $6,000 on each premium.
Wow.
Then they're still missing, they're still not selling the rest of the trip. So I went to Lars again and went, Lars, I don't want to charter this time because you've got other people on board, but you've got like, let's say, you've got 50 cabins unsold. Can I buy those cabins at a discounted rate? So they do their figures and go, oh yeah, and I went, oh no, that's a bit too expensive. Oh, okay, well, so they give me this very good price. So I go back to Dennis and go, Dennis, all of the people who couldn't travel on those two trips because they're cancelled, how many of those do you think you could get back for a later cruise? He said, oh, I think you can get most of them. So we got most of them back, paid again, because they got refunded.
Yeah, of course.
Paid again. So we made another $1 million on that. So I get to the end of that season and went, not bad. Not bad, And that was the start then of getting into Antarctic cruising again, not now as a worker, but as an entrepreneur running my own. And it was just about this time that a German guy rang me, and never heard of him, Gunther Schultz. Hello, this is Gunther. Yeah, okay. Would you like to come on a Russian nuclear icebreaker to the North Pole? And I said, yeah, that'd be great.
God, I don't get any phone calls like that.
No, well, I don't get many more either. So I said, yeah, that'd be great. And he said, can you bring any, do you have any clients? I went, I'll try, but I didn't have anyone on short notice. So I turn up to Germany, I meet Gunther, and it was a very interesting meeting because I met him driving to the airport. We were flying up to Finland, where we would go from Finland across the border to Murmansk. Murmansk is right up the top there. It's where all the Lend-Lease stuff in the war, the Americans with Lend-Lease, all of that went into Murmansk to help Russia fight the Germans. Mm-hmm. So I meet Gunther. It's really early in the morning. We're driving to the airport. His secretary's there. She's chain smoking cigarettes. It's winter, so it's cold. It was coming out of winter, and he's chain smoking cigars. So I remember that vividly. I thought I was going to, asphyxiate. It's like, Jesus Christ. Anyway, we get on the ship. We go to the North Pole, and it was, just endless party time. We used to meet...
On a Russian nuclear submarine?
On a Russian nuclear vessel, icebreaker.
Okay.
It's not a submarine. 75,000 shaft horsepower, 2 light water reactors, driving 3 propellers, and this thing is, you're banging through 10 foot of ice.
Wow.
And with icebreakers, it's not just the banging, you ride up, it's, the hull is undercut.
Yeah.
So in the really tough ice, it rides up and over and breaks with weight, basically, yeah. So this thing was fascinating, you know. Middle of the night, it wasn't real comfortable, because it was like, crrr, bomb, bang. So we go right up to the North Pole, have a great big party up there, have a swim in the, you know, where they've broken the channel behind, and all in all, pretty damn good experience. So we come back, and Gunter had a personality that wasn't really what the Russians wanted. He was very aggressive with them. He was critical of them. So they basically said, we don't want to do any more business with you, right? He was actually persona non grata in Murmansk. Don't come back to Murmansk, because this was Murmansk Shipping Company, who basically was the biggest company in Murmansk. You know, they ran a lot of things there. So I thought, well, this is an opportunity. So I called Murmansk Shipping and said, look, can I come and see you guys, and we'll you know, talk about me chartering the ship. And so I went up there, met the president and vice president, who became good friends, and they said, yeah, we'll charter. So again, I'm still using this other former Lindblad company to do all the bookings. So I get the nuclear icebreaker, we go out and advertise it, and we fill the 2 trips, right? So it was like, this is pretty cool. Then this was the time when we were actually on the nuclear icebreaker over near the Bering Straits, so not too far from Alaska, when Yeltsin took over power. You remember they attacked the White House, and so we were there. So we had this perestroika party where the Russians were on board, were really happy. We were sort of happy. And there was this big party to celebrate that, you know, the Soviet Union basically was breaking apart. So I kept, and at that stage, the Russians had so many ships that suddenly didn't have work, that had been built as either icebreakers or ice-strengthened vessels. So we started chartering. I ended up chartering 12 or 14 different ships over a period of time.
Wow.
To run specific, mainly Arctic and Antarctic. I didn't do much in between, although we did use a couple of the small, when I say small, 70 metre, 220 foot ships. When we were repositioning back to Russia, we would do dive trips along the way. So we did Seychelles, Seychelles was great. We did other stuff in the Indian Ocean going back, and then we ran other sort of exotic repositioning trips just to try and, you know, because you're paying by the day till you get back, so we're trying to offset it. Anyway, so that went on, and so Quark Expeditions, that's what we did for the next 10 years basically, was charter Russian ships, you know, send them to Antarctica and the Arctic, and the business built up, and eventually I took this guy who'd been doing the bookings, or his group. He was out of work then in 1992, so I said, well, Lars, I'll give you 50% of Quark. You come in and you run the day-to-day. And that's what he did. He came in and run the day-to-day. Towards the end of the 1990s, I don't know if it was 99 or 2000, I thought the company was becoming more mainstream. It was marketing, spreadsheets, and I was like, ooh, no. And at that stage, I'd started running the submarine trips to Titanic. We were running the...
Oh, yeah, those.
Yeah, those. we were running
I almost forgot.
We were running space stuff. We were sending people... The first guy we sent to the space station using the 3rd seat on Soyuz was 1998. Was a small guy good guy, very smart guy from California, Dennis Tito. He had a stock index called the Wilshire 5000, and he'd been an engineer with JPL, with the Jet Propulsion Laboratory, but he was one of the first guys to realise that you could use mathematical programs to manage stock investments. So he was a really bright guy. So he was the first to go up with that.
So at what point did you all of a sudden get into space?
1998. Just before that, you know, I had an interest in space, and I was one of the first investors and I didn't have a lot of money to invest, but in a company called Zero Gravity Corporation. Okay. So we ran Zero Gravity.
The parabolas.
The parabolas in a 727. Did a number of those. And then we started the space company. And then over a period of... We didn't make a lot of money out of the space company, but it was interesting. So we sent 8 people to the space station over... Between 1998 and 2010, we got...
While sending people to the Titanic.
Yeah.
Of course.
Yeah. Yeah.
Classic pairing, really.
Okay. I have to
Yeah.
add, how much was it to go to space, to the ISS?
The first guy that went up paid $17 million. Wow. Right, to go up. Trained in space in Star City, had to train for 6 months.
Like 6 months straight?
Yeah, well, pretty much 6 months straight.
Okay.
They gave him a bit of leeway because of business people.
But a full dedication?
Oh, yeah. And training in Star City with the Russian astronauts.
Okay.
All right, they're doing all the...
So it wasn't stroke a check for $16 million and you high-five somebody
No.
it's going at you?
No, and the Russians were very... They had very strict medicals.
Oh, I'm sure they did.
Very strict. And very professional. So he went up. And then subsequently, we had others go up. We finished at number 8. It was actually really number 7 because one guy went twice, right? And he paid probably... He would have been paying 20 mil a hit.
That's so interesting that he liked space so much. And how long were they in the ISS?
On flight.
Well, on the flight and then
in the space station.
Yeah.
It was about a 10-day round trip because what happens with the space station, even now, but especially in those days, Soyuz would go up and dock, right? There was already astronauts up there. They were due to come back. There was never a time when there wasn't a Soyuz docked because that was a lifeboat. If there was a breakdown there, so they'd go up on the new Soyuz, dock. Guys would get into the space station, including our clients, would get in. They'd spend, a certain amount of time there in the changeover. It wasn't like, you turn up, here's your hat, what's your hurry, we're out of here. So they would get on and, I forget the number of days, probably 5, 6, maybe 7 days in the space station, living, weightless and doing all that sort of stuff. Then they'd get in the returning Soyuz, which is the one that's already been up there for a while. And then, as you know, they land out on the Kazakh steppes. So the Russian capsules always come down in Kazakhstan. And they land out on this, the Kazakh steppes are huge and they're these flat areas. So they'd come down, land by parachute, and then the Russians sort of knew where they were. They'd send the helicopters out and pick the guys up. So the last guy who went for us was the guy who owns Cirque du Soleil. He's a Canadian.
Glenn knew of him.
Yeah, Guy de la Liberté. Yep. He was the last one. Then we had another woman training, and I think I mentioned it the other night, Sarah Brightman, who's the wife of Andrew Lloyd Webber at the time, who wrote Phantom of the Opera and many other, musical things. And she was the first soprano to sing Phantom of the Opera. So she was going to go up. She started training. She paid money. And then, I don't know, partway through, she was in Moscow, but then her mother, I believe, got sick, and so she cancelled, and that was the end of it. I'm not in it anymore because we had a situation with our CEO who, in our opinion, caused a situation where we suddenly weren't shareholders anymore, which is, was a strange sort of sequence of events, but it was great. We didn't make a lot of money out of it. We could have if we stayed in longer, but these events happened. But it was fascinating in the meantime.
Oh, I bet. How was the Titanic submarine journey?
Well, the Titanic came out of 2 of the ships that I was chartering from the Russians to do these Antarctic things, came from an organization in Moscow called the Churchills Institute of Oceanology. Right? Now, ultimately, all of those ships belonged to the State Property Committee in Russia, but they were, hived out to various institutes. through the Academy of Sciences. The Russian Academy of Sciences back in the Soviet days was a very prestigious, powerful organization. It's after the Soviet Union started to fall apart, it wasn't really financed, and the Russians were absolutely at the cutting edge of science, up until the perestroika. Once that happened, it disintegrated. Not to say they still don't have some good scientists, but it's not as prestigious now. A lot of the people who would have worked there are out driving taxis or running their own businesses and whatever. So we were actually on the nuclear icebreaker going to the North Pole with a guy who was the president of the Explorers Club, and also a guy called Don Walsh, who was one of the two first people to ever dive to the Mariana Trench in a bathoscope called the Trieste. And it was actually designed by a Swiss adventurer engineer, but then subsequently bought by the US Navy. So when it dived to Mariana's Trench, it was a US Navy. When I say bathoscope, that was a fancy name for basically a sphere hung under a great big bladder of diesel fuel, right? Because the diesel fuel, because of its lower specific gravity, if you let it go, it goes to the top.
Yeah, but what if it gets a leak on the way down?
You got a problem. You got a big problem.
Big problem.
Well, what you would do would, the way they go down is to put weights on them.
Yeah, you would release the weights.
And you release the weights and then you go up. So a pretty basic system, but that's what all submersibles do. Now, in the Russian case for these Mir 1, Mir 2 subs, they used to fill tanks with water.
For ballast.
And down you go. And then they also had nickel shot that you could jettison. But nickel shot was so expensive, they never jettisoned it. It was always pump out the water. A lot of the other subs have pig iron, bars underneath, and they've got a release mechanism.
Just drop it.
And people used to often ask me, well, gee, how do you get to the top? You drop the weight and you sit back and you're a cork.
Yeah.
Sit back, play some music, have a cup of tea, eat a sandwich, have a sleep, whatever you want, and you're just coming up.
So have you seen the Titanic?
5 times I've been on Titanic, yeah. And I've 5 times on Bismarck, the big German battleship,
Yeah.
and it's at 16,000 feet.
Which one was more impressive to you?
Probably, more iconic, Titanic, more impressive in some ways the Bismarck, because the teak decks are still on it. There's still a swastika on the back deck.
Oh, wow.
And if you remember, the only reason that the British Navy caught Bismarck was a torpedo from a biplane coming off the Ark Royal aircraft carrier, which were World War I aeroplanes, basically. They fired torpedoes at Bismarck, and one lucky shot, nothing hit it except one torpedo hit it in the rudder propeller area, bent the rudders into the propellers, or one of the propellers, and they couldn't steer. And Bismarck was basically turning in a circle, and they became sitting ducks. Otherwise, they would never have caught Bismarck, because it was heading for Brest in France, where the Luftwaffe commanded the skies. So, the British Navy wouldn't have come anywhere near it there, almost certainly. So that one lucky shot. And when we went out there, we're diving at 16,000 feet. It's got just a little part of the aft end broken off, but we could go down and you could see the propeller and the rudder.
Oh, wow.
Sort of, turned into each other. And the rest of it is intact, except it's got a lot of holes.
Yeah, I bet.
Right. And the bridge, you could see where, they wiped the bridge out with some, because the British just pounded it and pounded it and pounded it. So you could see where the projectiles had gone through the bridge, taken that out. But we could see still have one of the aeroplanes in the hangar, because they used to slingshot sideways, and then the pickup was a crane. They'd come in and they'd pick it up and whatever. But The big armament, they had 16-inch guns. All of that is out in the debris field because those 16-inch guns are not bolted down. They sit in the turret on a cogwheel. Yeah. So what normally happens with a vessel sinking to that depth, it starts to sink. Almost all of them then invert. And as a result, the big Japanese warship up near Guam, I'm trying to think, it sank in 600 feet of water, so it turned on its side and stayed on its side. The Bismarck went down, and it seems that the deeper you go, it's inverted, and then the air starts being pushed out and whatever, then they turn back up. So it's sitting, Bismarck's sitting on its, on its keel, but it landed on an underwater mountain. There's quite a lot of these small underwater mountains in the North Pacific, and it actually skied down the hill, right? Set off an avalanche. It was moving down the hill and then eventually moved across and stopped.
Wow.
So the starboard side, the mud is up to the gunnels, right up to the decks. The port side, you can go right down under the hull.
Oh, wow.
So the big armament, we went out to the big guns, which are out in the debris field. It used to have an admiral's bridge above the main bridge. That broke off, so that's out in the debris field. The smaller guns are all still in place. The anti-aircraft guns are still in place, and you drive around this thing, and it's like, wow, this is Bismarck.
Especially at that depth.
Oh yeah, it's a long way down. It's a 14 to 15-hour dive. Right, you're in the sub, and the sub's a sphere that's about 7 foot in diameter, right? Because all deep diving submersibles have to be a sphere, right? So it's room for 3 people. The sub pilot's got a bigger porthole. You've got 2 small portholes to the side. It's like a little bench, so you can sort of lay along it or sit on it or whatever. And then, of course, you've got outside cameras.
Yeah.
And you lose light on a sub dive, depending on the water and where you are. Somewhere between 600 to 800 feet, it goes dark. So then you've got to use the lights, which run off battery. So all the propulsion is battery. So you've got thrusters, and it's all battery.
So you were putting people into space while also checking out the Titanic and the Bismarck.
Yep. And then we did quite a lot of diving along, the hydrothermal vents, these big black smokers.
Yeah.
So down the middle of the Atlantic Ocean is what's called the Atlantic Ridge, and it's what's called a spreading zone. So there's actually material being forced up from inside the Earth, and it's spreading across the bottom of the Atlantic. So the Azores, for instance, is moving towards Portugal or that area. I don't know where it exactly would hit. So that plate, that spreading zone is moving away from that mid-Atlantic ridge. And, basically, as a result, it's very active. So you've got these big bellowing black smokers, and you have these shrimp swarms. I don't know whether you've ever seen it on videos or documentaries.
I think I have, actually.
They've got these massive shrimp swarms and all this really strange sort of biota. And, a lot of people think this may have been where life started.
Go get it.
What are they playing out there?
I don't know. Leave it on. I'll just mute your mic while you go out there.
So we did a lot of diving. Well, when I say a lot of diving, we did a couple of trips diving on these various black smokers, and that's fascinating. That's like primordial life. I mean,
I bet.
You sort of park there, and this gushing, very active. It's not like a little wispy smoke. I mean, this stuff is surging up there, and every now and again, one of the shrimp swarms will sort of get a bit too close, and they're wiped out. So these things have to be in. They've got to be in close, but you can't get too close.
Are the shrimp swarms there because of the temperature of the bellows? What
They're
draws them to?
they're there because there's a lot of nutrient because this stuff is bringing nutrients back up out of the inner part of the planet, of course. So you get there and you watch this stuff, and it's like, mamma mia. Yeah, remind me, Andy. I'll get your contacts, you guys, and I'll send you some footage of this.
Oh, please.
Because we did one of these trips we did with Jim Cameron. He came.
I know him as James when I talk to him.
Yeah.
When I'm consulting on his Avatar movies.
Yeah.
No, the other night you were talking, Jim Cameron. I'm scratching my head. I'm like, who the hell is that? Oh, it's fine. It's just the Avatar guy.
Yeah, it's James. He's just finished finally. So I did a number of trips with James Cameron. He did a IMAX documentary on Titanic.
It was fantastic. I've seen it.
Yep. So we were involved in that. Worked with him. I chartered his organisation, the ship and the subs. Cool. He knew the Russian main guy, Anatoly Sagalevich, who's a wonderful scientist, engineer. He ran the whole submersible operation. Jim had, he's a personal friend of Jim's as well. In the original Titanic Hollywood movie, if you remember, in the very early part of the movie, you see two submersibles. Mm-hmm. Yeah. They're them. They're the same ones that we used subsequently. So Jim's a very good friend of Anatoly still and was for many years. So when he wanted to do the IMAX, at that stage I'd been chartering already I started Titanic in 1998, going to Titanic. Jim had already knew Anatoly, so when I first met Jim or was in contact with him was 2000, I think. He and another guy, an Australian guy who became a close personal mate, said, look, we want to do this IMAX movie, and you're working with Anatoly on the subs and the support vessel. So we put that together. Then we did the Bismarck as well. He did a documentary for Discovery Channel after we'd been to Bismarck the first time. We were the first people to lay human eyes on Bismarck. Robert Ballard found Bismarck and Titanic, but with Bismarck, he only ever put down a photography sled. Gotcha. He dragged the thing through. So nobody had actually been there and dived on it with a submarine. So. And I remember the first.
I can't even imagine what that is like when that comes into view and the first time. Well,
I'll tell you a short story there. So,
were you that person also who saw it for the first time?
Yeah. With a lot, three of us in the sub. So, we were trying to find out the exact position of Bismarck. Robert Ballard knew where it was, but of course, it was confidential information. At his place in his part. So we were going to get a guy to do a renavigation. There's a guy, American guy, lives in England, who's he is the guru of renavigation, which is going back and looking at all the data. How far does a dead body with a life jacket on
drift?
Float? Yeah. How debris from a ship? How far does it float in what period of time? And this guy's name's David Mearns, and I mean he's unbelievable in terms of renavigation, and he's found a hell of a lot of warships and other ships as well. So we got him to do a renavigation investigation, and he gave us a box, and we were going to go out and side scan sonar and find it, but along came an opportunity from somebody who had the coordinates to buy them from them. So Jim and I bought the coordinates, and so we went out first. Jim came out later with his documentary team, and his brother was a guru with little robot ROVs that could fly off the could fly off the subs on a fibre optic line, and he used those on Titanic, for instance, to go down seven decks into the Turkish baths, into cabins, using these little bots, as they call them. Brilliant stuff. Yeah. And when Jim does anything, it's brilliant. I mean, the guy's a genius, and even though he's not a trained engineer, his ability with technology and to understand engineering and whatever is phenomenal. Guy is, not just a genius in terms of lighting and directing movies, and he writes his movies. He wrote Avatar. He had a writing group helping him, but it's his.
Yeah.
He's the one who's written. He's now written Avatar 2 and 3 and 4 and 5. They've already shot most of 3. It'll come out at the end of next year. I haven't seen how this one's
It's past 1 billion before we came out here.
Right.
And I know that he was saying that it would have to be 2 and 3
billion,
would need to be in the top 5 grossing movies of all time to be able to fund 4 and 5. And
exactly. They're going to take a hiatus after 3 and see what the results are, and then move to 4 and 5, which last time I talked to him was he's partially, if not almost fully written 4 and 5. But, I was just in the Republic of Georgia. Frederick Paulson, I'll introduce you to Frederick, who came in now. He's here tonight. He's one of the partners here.
I saw him in the mess hall today.
Yeah. No, Frederick's a very wealthy guy and a very smart guy. I forgot my train of thought.
Talking about Cameron. You were last time we were talking to Cameron.
Yeah, so we were talking about Jim and Frederick's birthday in the Republic of Georgia just recently. Jim's main business manager, Maria, was there. And, we know Maria. Maria's a friend of Frederick's as well. And I said...
10 minutes to what?
Finish with the plane.
What plane? That's on you.
Yeah.
We got 10 more minutes of this. You're good.
Yeah. So basically, I said to Maria, what's Jim up to? Because Avatar, and she said, and this is typical of Jim. When Jim does anything, he's so focused and he's so organised. Coming from the chaotic side of the human species, I look at Jim and go, Mama mia, I wish I had that focus, or his ability to focus and just run the thing. She said, I think it premiered on December 15th or December 14th. She said he's working just, right up to the end, just perfecting. She said, I'm his business manager, and even I can't, I don't send him emails because he doesn't have the time. But, he's a perfectionist, and when he does something, it comes out pretty perfect. So anyway, we did a number of things there. We went back. I want to say Jim went back and did. Titanic again, and again they were using a fibre optic thing from the surface to go down, and Jim likes pushing the boundaries of technology, so they went out and did that. Then he did one called Aliens of the Deep.
I have not seen that one.
Which is an IMAX movie again, and it was about the hydrothermal vents, and some of the shots there collectively, he put down 4 submarines on the. There's a remnant stack, probably the highest one there is. One of these remnant stacks of basically a dead smoker. It's still got hot water coming off the top. It's this incredible looking underwater formation.
I have seen this.
Yeah, he put down 4 submarines there. He and I own 2 together, which are 1,000-metre subs. Lost City is about 800 metres. A lot of the other hydrothermal vents are much, much deeper. And here's this thing of 4 submarines, two of these acrylic subs that can go to 1,000 metres, plus the 2 MERS that can go to 6,000 metres. And they're all on, Jim as one of his brilliances is lighting. He knows how to light things. So he's sort of backlighting, and one sub sort of lights the other and whatever, and it's this phenomenal thing of, I must go back and see that. I'm sure that must be available somewhere on Netflix or somewhere.
It is.
And look at that again, because, that shot. I've dived on Lost City myself in the MERS, and then you see the 2 deep rovers down there as well. I wasn't on board for that voyage, but some phenomenal stuff.
With all the subs and exploration in that area, is it, with all the shipping losses that we had in World War II between New York and the UK and Russia, did you find in the process of finding the Bismarck and the Titanic, were there just tons of other vessels down there?
There are, and we didn't find Titanic at all. Titanic was found by Robert Ballard, right, who was working with Woods Hole Oceanographic Institution. And, Ballard is the premier explorer of the ocean. He's probably retired now, or I've only ever met him once at a thing called the Grove. But he found both Titanic, that he actually dived on with a French deep diving sub, and then he found a Bismarck, as I said, with underwater detection stuff, this sled. So Ballard probably is the premier oceanographic whiz kid for the in the last, say, 30 years or more, 40 years. Titanic was found in the 1980s, late 1980s. Bismarck, I forget exactly when they found Bismarck, but he's found other World War II wrecks. There were throwaway numbers when we were fiddling around with this of saying there were estimates that there's 2 million wrecks in the world's oceans, going back to Phoenician trading vessels in the Mediterranean. So if you looked at all sorts of vessels, not just warships and whatever, there's a huge number of sunken vessels, but ranging from very small and very old. Now, where do they get a number like 2 million? Out of the hat. It's just meant to say there's a lot down there. And, there's some active salvors still out there if they can, get the information. For Spanish wrecks, the Spaniards were very proactive in analysing what happened if they lost vessels, mainly because there was often king's cargo on board. And the riches that they took out of Peru, Bolivia, Colombia and Central America made Spain a world power back in the days of the Armada and whatever. So, if they lost a ship coming back from South America or Central America, they took it seriously. And they'd always hold a court of inquiry, investigation, if there were survivors particularly. Otherwise, they would try, there were often surviving vessels in the same fleet. They could say, we were in a filthy storm here, we saw the other vessel at this time of the day, next day we couldn't find them, they weren't sighted, they never arrived back. So it gave them an approximate position. Their problem was they couldn't estimate longitude, right? Latitude you estimate with the sun passing through local midday and using a sextant, or in those days, whatever similar instrument. You can work out your latitude. Longitude required chronometers. You had to have an accurate time. And there's a couple of books written about the British guy or English guy who invented the chronometer. Once they got chronometers, then they could do an accurate thing of longitude. Otherwise, they had to do it by dangling a rope out and, really sort of pretty basic stuff. So getting deep water wrecks were hard to find. Shallow wrecks, often the Spaniards went back and salvaged them. They had divers, many of them Indian pearl divers, for instance, who were almost like slaves. They would take them out and send them down, and they used to salvage quite a reasonable amount. But of course, a lot of it would all stayed there. We actually we started a company in 2012, I guess. I started it with a marine archaeologist and a guy who I'm still partners in this company with, who is the guru of searching for Spanish vessels. And he's still out there now, in Bahamas. Later on, remind me, I'll show you some of the stuff he's been pulling up recently, these gold chains and a lot of emeralds and whatever.
Because there's serious amounts of treasure that's
There's serious
has
amounts of
about
treasure. We were not involved with. I wish I had been, but then subsequently, I'm glad I wasn't. There's a guy in Florida who's he was formerly Cuban, and he was a Cuban marine archaeologist. So spent his earlier life looking for Spanish wrecks. Probably one of the largest number of Spanish wrecks are around Cuba, because the fleet coming from South America, which used to come out of Panama, it used to go Panama, Colombia, pick up treasure there, go up to Cuba. The Mexican or Central American fleet used to come over to Cuba. They would both meet in Havana. Normally, they'd get out and re-victual, fix the boats. The boats often were in poor condition for woodworm and all this sort of stuff. Then they'd all go back together in a bigger fleet for protection. But the thing that brought them to grief was normally storms, hurricanes or really strong wind events. They used to come up the channel between Florida and the Bahamas, and you know what the Bahamas is like. It's reefs, sandbanks, so they only had to get blown off course there. And so we're working now in Bahamas mainly on a boat called, or a 1656 vessel called Maravilla. And I'll show you later, there's gold chains and all this sort of stuff coming up from there. So, because I had this Antarctic experience, I was always interested in more Antarctic stuff. And I was reading a magazine in Australia in 1986, and I saw just a little article that said this company called Adventure Network International was going to go to South Pole. And they were offering commercial trips to South Pole. And I thought, wow, that's interesting. So, boy, I'd be interested in that. So, Adventure Network had been set up in 1985. A guy called, I forget his first name, Bass, who owned Snowbird. Dick
Utah.
Bass. Dick Bass, yeah. Dick Bass.
Great name, by the way.
Yeah,
Dick Bass.
yeah, Dick Bass, yeah.
It's two first names.
Yeah, I met Dick a number of times up at Snowbird there. He was a character. He passed away, unfortunately. But he wanted to do the 7 summits, right? Highest mountain on each continent. To do that, he had to come here. So he contacted the founders of Adventure Network, were basically Martin Williams, Giles Kershaw, and a Canadian guy, and there were a couple of other guys who got kicked out of the sort of group there. Pat Morrow was the Canadian guy, and they're all mountain climbers and whatever. So they set up to come down and get Dick to the mountain, which they subsequently did, and Dick went on, I think, and I don't know whether Dick ever actually finally summited Everest, but that was the initial part. So 1987, they were planning the 87-88 season. So, the season we always put, it's November, December through to the next year. So 87-88. So I thought, wow, that's cool. So I rang this number or contacted, and it was a guy called Martin Williams, who subsequently became very close friends. And he was one of the guys with us when we dog sledded to the North Pole. 56 days of, days of enjoyment, some days of misery. And so Martin, I called Martin, can you bring any clients? But come yourself, but can you bring any clients? And I said, yeah, okay, I think I can. So I turned up in late November with some clients to go to South Pole. And it was interesting, when I first arrived at Punta Arenas Airport, Punta Arenas is famous for its winds. It's windy. It's always windy. So I get off the plane, and in those days there was no, you had to disembark down the steps and walk. So I disembark, and I'm walking across the terminal, and I look, and here's this DC-4, but it's only got 3 engines. There's obviously an engine missing. So I thought, oh, that's interesting. So Martin's there, and Martin's a very, he's got a lot of energy. And he said, oh, Mike, really, he's originally English, got sort of reddish hair. And, oh, Mike, great to see you. And, yeah, it's really good you can come. And I think I had 5 or 6 clients or something. And I said, Martin, just a matter of interest, does that aircraft fly on 3 engines? And as a bit of a joke, he went, oh, no, but, the winds, they didn't tie the propellers down, and the winds turned the propellers, and it's buggered up something inside the engine. Well, okay. So what's the plans for fixing it? Oh, no, we've got spare parts. We've got spare parts coming. Oh, okay, good. So 6 weeks later, we're still in Punta Arenas, right? The plane still hasn't flown. And they've got a chunk of people down ready to, might have been a little bit less, but our trip, the first trip to South Pole was 6 weeks wait. I sent the clients home and they had to come back again. So anyway, I did the first season where I got to know all the people involved, and so that was good. That was the start of that. Next year I came back, I brought clients but became more integrated into the operation, and then the following year I started to buy shares in the company. Some of those guys wanted to get out, they wanted to get their money, so I was sequentially over the next few years buying parts of it. And then one of the original founders, Giles Kershaw, who was the guru of flying twin otters around Antarctica, he crashed a gyrocopter just over near the British base and died. They were filming for National Geographic. He went up in this gyrocopter and the wind inverted him. So his wife took over his shares. We bought everyone else out, and then we continued all through the 90s as I was the majority owner. She had a fairly significant but minority share, and she ran the day-to-day stuff, and I did my normal thing of let's do that, let's not do that, but she ran day-to-day. So,
and is that what became ALE?
Yes. So we went to the end of Adventure Network, was the brand name for Antarctica. There was nobody else operating in Antarctica in the interior. We were the only ones. And it was a struggle, because in those days we were using DC-4s and a DC-6, and we didn't have a lot of money. And we were over at Patriot Hills, where it's really windy, and half the days of the year we couldn't land because the main winds are at right angles to the runway, so you'd have a beautiful day, but there'd be a 20-knot, 90-degree wind. So, we'd end the season, we'd have 30 drums of fuel on the ground, and we had to fly, more fuel in, and it was really seat of the pants.
Yeah.
But we were still doing good things, we're taking people in all over the place, not as many places as we do now, but so that evolved. At the end of, we bought the first commercial Basler, these ones out here. All the rest had been military or CIA. As I said the other night, they sold gunships. The Thai Army bought, or Thai Air Force bought them. The Mali in West Africa, Air Force bought them. The US bought a lot for drug interdiction down in Colombia. But we bought the first one. And I've been the lucky recipient on the insurance side of the ship stuff. So the second season, we have the Basler sitting over next to the camp, and 100-mile-an-hour wind comes up, gets under the wing, collapses the gear, because their weak point is the gear, side-loaded, because it's a retracting. So it collapses the gear goes all up through the fuselage, it's kaput. So we had it insured, fortunately, and the insurance company again, it was Lloyd's of London. It was a syndicate with a lead syndicate running it. I went over to see them, and they said, well, we're going to send people down and repair it and bring it back. I was like, oh, okay. And we said, well, that's going to be, it was actually then, I'm just trying to get my dates right, we sold the company, right? We sold Adventure Network because along came what I call a roll-up company. They go around and buy. So they were buying all little boutique travel organizations.
Put it under one umbrella.
And it was, one of these private investment companies putting the money up. North Castle Partners, I think it was at that stage. And so these guys bought one company. The first one they bought, the guy who owned it happened to be a friend of ours. So he said, oh, you've got to buy Adventure Network. Now, why they bought us, I don't know, because we were real seat of the pants stuff. We weren't standard mainstream. But their accountancy gurus who said, wow, over here, we're getting sometimes $180,000 for one person. Well, what it was an expedition that was funded by, so it really was a bad way to analyse the income, So our normal income was 25 grand a person or 30 grand, but they'd see these ones 180 grand, 200 grand for a private expedition. So they saw us as a growth market or whatever, which it wasn't. So we sold it. 2 years later, I bought it back for 20 cents in the dollar. And we were, at that stage, the other company, this roll-up company, had decided not to run the season, right? Because they were in legal dispute now with Anne, this lady who'd been a co-owner with me all through the 90s. And she'd stayed with them as a manager, and I think they paid me 2 years as a consultant, but I never consulted, so it was like, yeah, okay.
So is that where the name change went from A&I to ALE?
Well, what happened then was we noted that they weren't going to run a season, right? I had a non-compete, but my non-compete was almost up. So I thought, we'll set up a new company, right? They're not going to run the season. We'll set up a new company, and even if the non-compete hadn't run out, we weren't competing because they weren't going there. But I thought I'll be very, very careful. So we didn't set the company up till it was August, I think, in 2002. And I said, I went to my brother because he'd been helpful through the years. Said, look, I'll help you get set up. And you come in as a 25% shareholder, which he's been fantastic, all the work he does. He does a lot of the hell of a lot of the back office stuff, and he's a very detailed guy, which I'm not, and that's great. And then we took in another two partners, including a guy who'd worked for us for many years, and he'd spent 20 years working for the British in Antarctica, dog sledding and everything. So we thought, we'll set up a new company, and we'll call it Antarctic Logistics and Expeditions, because we wanted the word Antarctic in there, because clearly for web searches and whatever, you try and, we weren't smart about engineering any of that, but we at least went, we'll put the word Antarctic. But right at the same time, these guys, so we were going to have to start from scratch, right? We were going to have to buy camps, we were going to have to buy fuel, we were going to have to establish a new brand name, so it wasn't going to be easy. So right at this time, these guys ring me, and the first thing they did was threaten to sue me. I'm on Titanic, right? We're out of Titanic. I get this phone call, this guy who I knew from that company, and he said, Mike, we're suing Anne about non-compete. I said, yeah, I know that, yeah. He said, well, we got emails between you and her. And I said, well, that's good. I've got them as well. So that's just
neat.
That's just
cool story.
Yeah, that's perfect. Well, we think that you've broken your non-compete. And I said, well, I guarantee you I haven't broken non-compete. He said, well, our lawyers think we can sue you. And I said, well, I've been to the mat before, because with Titanic, the right to dive on that went to the Supreme Court of the United States. And we didn't win in the Supreme Court because the Supreme Court said this is not a
constitutional issue.
This is not a constitutional issue. So we had a 3-0 win in the Fourth Circuit Court of Appeals. So Supreme Court said, no, not for us, whatever the appeals court. So we won that. So that was like $500,000 that I couldn't get back because we were actually fighting a lower court. We weren't fighting the Salvor, the salvage company, was actually the one behind it, but they hid behind the court. So you sue a court or you contest a court, you can't claim the damages. So I said to this guy, mate, whatever you want to do, get your lawyers and I'll fight it because it's just not true. I'd been very specific because I didn't want to compete because I didn't want to go back in, right? Because I knew the setup costs and to try and get the infrastructure down here, it was like, oh, screw that. And this is this is now 2002, so I'm still running Titanic. We're still doing the space stuff, and it was like, oh, I don't need any more. Anyway, 2 weeks later or 3 weeks later, the guy rings me and says, Mike, would you be interested to buy the company back? And I said, well, what price? And he gave me a price not much less than what they had paid us. And I went, no, too expensive. Anyway, he came back then and we negotiated, and I forget what we settled at. Whatever it was a bargain. Because we sold the company with 30 drums of fuel on the ground. They sold it back to us with 600 on the ground. They sold us then the brand name, which had been, had existed for 15 years, so everybody knew it.
Yeah, equity in that.
Yeah. And they'd also done a lot of camp enhancement, so we got all that. So we made enough in the first year to pay it all off. And they gave me, I brought the others in, but the others had no contact with this company. They gave me 12 months to pay. So that was good. So we bought it back. We immediately ran the season because there was a lot of pent-up demand because they were going to cancel. And we made it, we made enough profit, as I said, to cover the costs of acquisition. And then we ran it with two brands. We ran Adventure Network International for the tourist side of things. We ran Antarctic Logistics and Expeditions for the expeditions, the mountain climbing, and also government work. Because, the government, we always felt the government's buying services from us, and we called Adventure Network. It's like, these are a bunch of, cowboys on motorbikes or whatever. This Antarctic Logistics and Expeditions sounded more serious. So we ran two brands for quite a while, and I mean quite a while. We were over at Patriot Hills, which was very windy and a much more difficult place to work with. And then in 2007, one of the partners came over here and searched this area. We knew where the blue ice runways were because we had an advisor, a British guy, a British scientist who was the expert in Antarctica on blue ice areas. So he said, guys, there's a good blue ice area over here. Go and check it out. So Mike Sharp, one of the partners at that time, who's no longer a partner, he sold his shares to Frederick because he wanted to just retire, live in England and enjoy life. He came over, did a survey, then we sent one of the Aleutians over to do a test landing, and then Mike found this area, which the Patriot Hills area was, the camp was just a kilometre from the runway. So people could walk at times, backwards and forwards. So this was 7 or 8 kilometres away, but it gave us this area which is, we get wind here, but nothing like over there.
Talking about where we're sitting now.
Where we're sitting now, yep.
And how do you, both with the first company and ALE, how do you get the rights to be here? Do you have to negotiate with the governments involved in the Treaty of Antarctica, or how does that work?
Anybody operating in Antarctica, now, I mean, if you were an Afghani and you came down here and said, I'm not going to go through any treaty nation, could anybody do anything? No, not really. But the way the governments can constrict people is the treaty nations are all the gateways. So Australia's a gateway,
they can
New Zealand's a
access.
gateway, Argentina's a gateway.
Yeah.
So if you came in, now people have done it. People have got on a yacht and sailed down to parts of Antarctica without a permit. But if it's an Afghani citizen coming from Afghanistan, as an example, or a Syrian coming from Syria, there's no what we call, or not what I call, but what is called enabling legislation. So as an Australian citizen, you as American citizens, if you do something down here that contravenes the Antarctic Treaty, if I go around drop-kicking penguins, go down there and start booting penguins.
Jesus, Mike, that's quite an example. But
Yeah. Well, it's an extreme example, but I've seen people way back in the old days pick a penguin up and throw it to the next guy, sort of thing. Okay. Now, if you did that, even though you're in an area that is not controlled by any one nation, as an Australian citizen, they can prosecute me in Australia. They can do the same to the US and most countries, most European countries. There's now about 40, I forget the number now, or I don't know the number of people who've signed up to the treaty. It's about 50 nations. It was originally 12 or 13. Now there's 50. So to come here, we need to get a permit from a treaty nation, but a treaty nation that has a permitting system. South Africa, for instance, guys operated out of there. They did not have a permitting legislation. They do now. So we started off when the company was first formed, Adventure Network, and all through the 90s, we permitted via the Foreign and Commonwealth office in the UK. So we dealt with them. Our first office was in Vancouver.
So why go through UK versus Australia? Or
Australia are a pain in the ass in terms of trying to get permits. Not cooperative, don't like tourism, etc. Foreign Office in Britain they were quite good, but it became more convenient to do it through the American system. The American system is very strict, but it's reasonable. We can work with them. We have a 5-year rolling permit, but every year we have to put in our environmental statement, estimate the fuel use, the emissions, etc. So we have to deal with National Science Foundation, with the EPA, the Environmental Protection Agency, and the Department of State. We've got to sort of belly up to the bar with all sorts of applications and background and all that sort of thing. So we do that. So we permit through the US. So to do that, we set up the office in Salt Lake City. So we're a US company operating on a US permitting system. And all the ships, they all need to get a permit from a permitting nation. Right. So it's quite strict from that point of view. Now, of course, the ship-based tourism in the peninsula is, something's going to happen there in terms of restrictions, because when we were on the Lindblad Explorer, as I said, we were the only boat. We used to put through maybe 500 people, 600 people a year.
Probably doing that a day, I bet.
They're not even doing it a day. It'd get up to close to that a day. They're talking this year, I think, in the peninsula, 110,000.
Wow. With
50 ships and increasing. So at some stage, the treaty as a group moved fairly slowly, because you need, I believe, unanimity, and that's really hard to get with all the different countries. All right, they're back. Okay.
They're back.
Yeah.
That's right, they can wait.
Yeah. So we go through that permitting system, and we operate via the US, who are strict but reasonable. We've made sure that we try very hard to be productive for governments and science. So we do a lot with governments. We provide logistics and we provide science support. We just did a big lot with the Brazilians. We normally do stuff for the Americans, do it for the British, do it for the Chileans, at times for the Argentinians, this year for the Germans. Because this area, we're it, and are we any great sort of intellectual geniuses for being it? No, we just happen to be it, because it's remote and it's hard to operate. And we've built up infrastructure over many years. So ALE, it's a bit of a funny acronym, ALE, ale, do you make beer? No, we don't make beer. We run commercial operations in Antarctica. We take people to the South Pole, as you know. We've got mountain climbing. We go out to the Emperor Penguins. We have this year probably 18 people skiing 1,000 kilometres to South Pole. We've got, we run vehicles to the South Pole. We can do bespoke expeditions. We've done 3 filming contracts this year with, pretty high-end documentary films, including, some Hollywood-based people as well.
Including Black Rifle Coffee.
Yeah. Now, here are these dudes turn up, and we saw this. Via PH, one of our advisors for skydiving. He said, "Look, I've got this group. They're all ex-US Special Forces. As it turns out, there's one Canadian.
We call it maple syrup.
Yeah, maple syrup. Yeah. These guys want to come and they want to do 777. Well, we know the concept 777 because we've done it for a marathon.
Yep.
The only difference for the marathon is it's easier for them because they had 60 people or whatever. They could afford to have their own plane.
And they care less about the weather.
Yeah, exactly. So, we saw this group coming, and I was backwards and forwards with PH about, okay, what do they want to do? And Jim Whittington, of course, we've had before, so we knew Jim. My son was like, he calls me Mike. My kids have, for whatever reason, they've never called me Dad. It's always been, ever since they were little, Mike. And basically, it's because, they used to hear my wife and people around me call me Mike, so they just started calling me Mike, and I went, I don't really care. They know I'm their dad. So they still to this day call me, if they refer to another person, they might say my dad or...
But to your face, it's
Mike. But to
Mike.
my face, it's always Mike. Always has been, both of them. So Timothy went, Mike, have you seen who's on this list? And I went, no. And I looked at it and went, I don't recognise any of them. And of course, as I said, he's always been interested in special forces and that side of things. I think in another sort of return to life, he might go into the army or whatever, because he's really interested in security special forces. He went, there's this guy called Andy Stumpf, and he has this podcast, and it's great. And he said, and there's dudes there from Black Rifle Coffee. And Timothy has always been following Black Rifle Coffee. And he said, and there's this guy, Evan, whatever Evan's second name is.
Hafer.
And these other two guys, and he said, they're all special ops guys, they're SEALs or they're Rangers or they're whatever. And that to him, it was like, wow. And I went, okay, sounds cool. Be interesting to meet these guys when they come. So, the whole thing of Black Rifle Coffee now, it's like, I better check out what Black Rifle Coffee is. But obviously it's just good quality coffee. Yeah. But the thing that he said, which, is relevant here, he said, these guys do all of this work for veterans, veterans or veterans' families who are struggling. Either they've lost the veteran or the veteran's incapacitated, doesn't have earning ability, et cetera, et cetera. So he said, this is going to be cool to meet these guys. And I went, yeah, okay. So here we are. And, we've done the first skydive, and hopefully we'll get the one. The weather's still looking good for Monday.
Yeah.
We'll track that carefully because the weather starts to improve tomorrow evening. If it looks like suddenly Monday's going to the crapper, then we'd have a look here.
It still puts us well in line with what we're trying to accomplish. And I don't know if people will be able to hear, but we've basically taken over our communal space, and so everybody's back now. And we actually have been at it for like 3.5 hours. And I don't want to stop yet.
Have we?
We have. No, that's how you know you're having a great conversation. But I want to give them their space back because they're going to be whiny little. We call them sniveling little cunts. I don't know if you've ever heard of that term. But
I've often used it, actually.
It's one of my favorite things about the British, and Australians, the full mastery of the word.
Yes. Yeah,
out of everything that you have accomplished in your life and all the things that you've done, what do you have left that you still want to do?
Basically, one of the, I'd call it a sad reality, or at least a reality of life is, as you get older, there are certain things that I can't do now that I could do before. I've got 2 replacement knees. I wore those out. You're definitely less dexterous. I know when I'm climbing in and out of vehicles, it's like I look like a seal trying to get in. And that's just a fact of life. It's a little bit, think, this is screwed, but it is what it is. So can I go back and, do some of the, dog sledded to the North Pole, we dog sledded across Greenland, dog sledded up the east coast of Greenland. We did a big man hauling, or what we thought was a big man hauling from South Pole down the Scott Glacier to the Ross Ice Shelf. We've done a lot of physical things as well. But there are things now that reality is, I'm not going to be able to do those. People often say, well, you've been, I don't know how many countries and how many islands we've been to. They'll say, oh, you've been everywhere. And it's like, dudes, that is the most senseless statement that's ever made. I mean, who's been everywhere in the United States of America? Who's been everywhere in Australia, even if you're citizens? And then you look at all of the countries and all of the different things, and I'm not a list ticker. Would I go back to many of the places I've been? Absolutely. You go back because memories fade and they're beautiful and whatever. So I've got a list, and my list never decreases because I sit with guys like you, other people, and they tell me stories, and it's like, oh shit, I've got to go to that place. Watching the movie last night, I've trekked in Nepal, and I've been down to the southern, river rafted in southern Nepal down to the areas where they've got the rhinos and the tigers and elephants and whatever. So I've been to Nepal, but have I seen all of Nepal? No. And watching that movie last night of those scenes of Everest up at that high camp area where you guys were skydiving, some of those visions of the mountains there, it's like, wow.
Yeah.
Wow. I did a trek a long time back in Pakistan. You can go up what's called the Baltoro Glacier, and it goes up to an area called Concordia. So you've got K2, and you've got Gasherbrum 1, 2, 3, 4, and you've got Masherbrum, all of which are 8,000 metre peaks, or most of them. And then you've got this area as you trek up called Trango Towers, which is these big granite spires. It's absolutely magnificent. So I look at that and go, and I wanted to go into K2 from the Chinese side, because this was the Pakistani side. Didn't do it. I regret not going to Afghanistan and Syria in the good days, because, Syria was at the cross-section of the world at that stage between Romans and Greeks and Persians and whatever. And, some of the stuff that's been destroyed there now is, it's horrible historically. Libya, I've been in Libya illegally because we did a big desert trip out of Egypt. And we went up inside Libya before we crossed what's called the Great Sand Sea in western Egypt. We're in a Unimog, those big German army vehicles.
Yeah.
So we're in a Unimog there. I wish I had another 75 years because I could fill it out with stuff. And, I like going bird watching. Love to get into more of the Amazonian rainforest area before it's all cut down and gone. There's a place called the Mulu Caves in Malaysia, where these giant limestone caves come up out of the jungle. And you guys must have a ton of places also you can look at and go, yeah, I'd like to go there. One of my problems is I pick up travel magazines and it's like, oh yeah, I want to go there. And I want to go there. And my wife's going, you can't travel all of your life. And it's like, well, I'm going to try. I'll give it a good whoosh, so to speak.
I'll give it my best effort for sure.
Yeah. I've done a lot in Australia, but there's a lot I haven't done. So we bought a couple of Toyota new Land Cruisers and changed all the suspension underneath and, put rooftop tents and all of that. And Frederick, I'm taking Frederick to an area up in northwest Australia called the Kimberley area, which has, these really strange rock formations and waterfalls and rivers and all that sort of stuff. So to me, the idea that you've been everywhere, it's the most nonsensical thing to say. And I can remember a really funny incident in the very early days of Lindblad Explorer. I was, new to we were doing a trip we did a lot of trips in China in 1978, 79, just after Nixon and Kissinger you remember they had ping pong diplomacy. They had ping pong teams as a way of, getting to talk to each other. And that, it was again a Lindblad Explorer. And again, this was Lars Erik Lindblad's vision that he suddenly went, here's an opportunity. We'll go to China. So we did over 20 cruises over a couple of years there, and went into Tibet very early at the end of the 70s when Tibet was Tibet, because now the Chinese have put, Han Chinese, and now are taking over Tibet. They treat the Tibetans really poorly. I looked at things like that, and as I said, I was sitting there one day and I'm just new on the boat and quite excited about everything. And actually, these people came back to China, but the original thing happened on a trip going to Antarctica. So I sat down and there's a American guy from US who was a colonel, retired colonel, and so he's introduced himself. I'm Colonel whatever from Texas. Okay, great to meet you, mate. And his wife was there, and she was a big bosomed, sort of blonde dude. And she had a T-shirt on, or a sweatshirt that said, "My name is Peaches." And I looked at this and I didn't know whether I was staring at her boobs or the thing. I said, is your name really Peaches? And she said, yes. And that was obviously a nickname. So everyone calls me Peaches. And I was like, oh, okay. So we're sitting there and they said, this woman said, we've almost travelled everywhere. And I went, oh, yeah, okay, that's good. And this was my early travel days. I hadn't done a lot of this other stuff. And I thought, oh. And so over comes another lady. I don't know where she was from. I can't remember. She was English speaking. So she sat and everyone's going, oh, hello. And we go off to Antarctica. Hello, how are you? And then the conversation went into, where have you been in your life? And, each of them were telling stories. And then Peaches said, oh, we've been almost everywhere. And this is our last continent. Well, collecting 7 continents is not exactly difficult these days. Antarctica was the most difficult, because you couldn't do it under normal circumstances. And, Peaches became, quite arrogant and obnoxious. Anyway, this other woman said, have you been to the cave paintings in southern Algeria? Because there's very famous cave paintings in southern Algeria. And Peaches went, no, I haven't. Then this woman stood up and said, well, then you should shut up because you haven't been everywhere. And she stomped off. So I was left sitting there going,
There's always a bigger fish.
Yes, there's always a bigger fish. So, no, I've got I wouldn't say endless, but pretty much for me it'll be an endless list because I'll never get to it, all of it. But Mongolia I haven't been. I'd like to go to Mongolia. There's areas not just areas, but countries in Eastern Europe I haven't been. I want to go through in the near future all the stans, Tajikistan, Kazakhstan, Turkmenistan, etc.
Be careful in the stands.
Yeah, you've got to be careful. Yeah, absolutely.
The stand can bite you in the ass.
Yeah.
Jericho, Logan, closing questions?
So I've just been putting your timeline together in my head as we've been walking across this, and
I can't put it together in my head, mate.
It's amazing. You got so much jam packed in it. It seems like you didn't have kids until into your 40s.
I had my son. I had an accidental Russian son. Very nice lady who was the English translator in Murmansk while we're running these nuclear icebreaker trips, and got associated with her one night, 3 bottles of vodka with... She operated out of the... They have what's called Siemens, and I don't mean...
Yeah.
I mean
that's
Seamen.
how babies are made.
Seamen. So I found out. Seamen off ships. They have a Seamen's club, but when the local boys are there. So we had a big party there, and she was attractive lady, and it was just one night, huge amount of vodka, and then some months later she contacted me and said, "Oh, by the way, I'm pregnant," and I went, "Oh, gee, well, okay," and there was just no way that it was going to end up in living together or marriage and whatever. So I'm still in touch with him. I don't see him very much because he couldn't get out of Russia for quite a while because he was in conscription age, and unless you had done your conscription, you couldn't get a passport. Then along came COVID. I'll bring him down here next year. He's haven't met him very many times, since he's grown up. He's 30 now. He's a member of the parliament there in the local parliament. He's in one of the opposition parties to Putin, but it's one of the accepted opposition parties because it has to look like a democracy. So it's the Communist Party, actually. It was Ziranov who just died. Ziranov was a controversial politician there. He just died. But really the first sort of mistake child was Timothy, who's here, and that was, I was 48 and a half. And then Kimberly, so my wife and I lived together, with the kids, and eventually, 2000, she'd been saying, I think we should get married, and I was, interested to do that, and we finally did it in Zermatt in Switzerland in the year 2000. So I was a late father. I wasn't sure I was going to be a father, and there wasn't a decision either way. So it's my first marriage and only marriage, and it will only be my only marriage, even if for some bizarre reason we separated. At my age, who needs to get married again? But I've got to say, it was a wonderful experience having the kids. The Russian son I really had no contact with, but with Timothy and my daughter Kimberly, it's been, and to me, anybody who doesn't have kids, and there's a lot of people don't, there is an element of life that's missed. Having children, and having them and watching them grow up, and now they give me nothing but cheek, and
That's what happens.
That's what happens, sort of level of playful derision, the old bastard, sort of thing. And, for me, that's just fun. So.
Jericho?
I was wondering, how many people have skydived here besides us?
We had, back in the 90s, before, we lost a couple who didn't deploy their chutes properly. That was 6 went out on that jump. Then we had some guys from Dubai came. That was a group of, say, 6 or 8. So that'd be 14. And then we had Jim and Bill Booth.
Mm-hmm. Tandem.
Both. Bill Booth was a solo.
Okay. Jim was a tandem, though.
Jim was a tandem with Tom.
Okay.
So that was, let's say, what was that? So that was 6.
7, 20.
Yeah, including you guys, 20, say, jumps total, 25.
Oh, wow.
Okay.
I was guessing it would probably be somewhere around 100, and I think these guys, yesterday, were saying 50-ish.
Now, none of the other commercial companies have done skydiving, that's for sure. But here, and I don't know what the US has done historically in terms of what's gone on at the bases. Not a lot. Skydiving at the bases, I would say there's probably close to 0 because they don't want to take the risk.
Yeah.
Here, I can get an exact number, but 25 to 30 maximum, and probably less.
Wow. Okay. I did not realize that.
It's pretty unique.
Well, I'm going to close it up because everybody's trying to come in.
Yeah.
On that note, I can't thank you enough for your time today and also the hospitality here at the camp. This has been, it blew away every expectation that I could have possibly had. I brought way too many cold clothing items.
Yeah. This has been an interesting stretch of weather because I was talking to the meteorological guys today and saying they're here, months on end, and both of them have done multiple seasons. Whereas, I come down for relatively, short or medium times here. And I said, I can't remember this many consecutive windless or almost windless low wind days. And they said, no, they think they're trying to remember back. So we've had...
abnormal for sure.
Yeah, abnormal for sure. Now, it may be just a cycle, as the guy said today. Well, we've had other years where there was more snow than usual. We haven't had a major snow event here for a long time this season. So, but I got to say, it's been, and I say this genuinely and seriously, that it's been, very pleasant for me to meet you guys and to meet the rest of your team and listen to your stories as well. Because, okay, I've got some stories. Each of you have got different but also equally interesting stories. And when it comes to the camp here, because, the head honcho is the one that gets told, oh, you run such a great camp. This camp is run by the staff. Yep. I parachute in, so to speak. Hello.
Literally a few days ago.
Yeah. Now that I've done something I've wanted to do.
I was going to say, did you count yourself on that list of jumpers?
I will, though, definitely will. And that was such an experience, I knew the view would be fantastic. And I'd only done one other tandem and, enjoyed that, but it was over, a bunch of agricultural or little agricultural area. But certainly, the Tim Hewitt, who runs the camp, and Fred also, who's his 2IC, and the staff here and the outer camps, the guys there. It's nice to say as one of the owners, oh, it's us, it's all us. That's rubbish. The team here is as good as we've ever had. As Tim said today, we've had really good teams most years, but this year, up till now, there's been no major dramas. We normally get some sort of drama, COVID or whatever. So it's gone very well, but it's the staff and team that make it work. We put a little oversight on it and pre-planning, and we take the risk, and we do a lot of the contractual stuff and all that sort of business. But when you come down to operating, Tim is a fantastic, number one person running the camp. But everybody, all the department heads, they're just great, and we feel, absolutely appreciative and privileged to have, and we'd love to keep as many of these people on. There'll be some who go off, they come down and do some seasons, and then, someone gets married, someone starts a business, whatever. So there is rollover, but it's all about the team, as you guys know. I mean, in the military, you read military history and everything's about the commanding general. Well, the commanding general ain't running the whole show. You filter that down through, division levels, battalion levels, company levels, section levels and whatever. If you don't have that integrated team and communications, you're nowhere. So been a pleasure, and I'm going to enjoy drinking Black Rifle coffee for a lot longer.
Yeah, we got to figure out getting
it down to Australia, or getting some in Salt Lake City as well.
The Salt Lake is an easy piece. That's a truck.
Yeah. Right.
Awesome. Thank you. Thank you for the time.
Pleasure,
That's
and
spectacular.
happy to sit and yarn.
Yeah, that's great.